Imagine you are presented with two separate gambling games, each one mathematically designed to make you lose money over time, and yet when you play them in a carefully alternating sequence, you somehow end up winning, which seems to violate every principle of probability and rational expectation that we understand about games of chance. This is the essence of Parrondo's paradox, discovered in 1996 by physicist Juan Manuel Parrondo, a phenomenon so counterintuitive that it challenges our fundamental assumptions about how losing situations combine and interact with one another. In the first game, you flip a coin that is ever so slightly weighted against you, losing just enough over many flips that your expected value becomes negative, a slow and steady drain of your resources with each round. In the second game, the rules become more complex, involving a coin flip that depends on your current wealth, a mechanism where your odds of winning or losing shift based on whether you have an odd or even amount of money, creating a hidden asymmetry that also results in a negative expected value when played in isolation. Yet here lies the remarkable twist. When a player alternates between these two independently losing games according to a particular pattern, or even sometimes randomly, the combination produces a winning strategy, a positive expected value that accumulates over time, defying the intuitive logic that two negative values should never produce a positive outcome. The mechanism underlying this paradox involves what mathematicians call a ratchet effect, where the wealth-dependent nature of the second game interacts with the coin flip of the first game in such a way that the sequence of plays creates a subtle bias toward accumulation, a directional drift in the random walk that favors increasing wealth over time. Think of it like a ball rolling in a landscape where the terrain is shaped such that although neither individual slope would move the ball forward, the combination of alternating between the two slopes somehow creates a net upward motion, a phenomenon that emerges purely from the interaction and sequencing rather than from the games themselves. What makes this paradox so philosophically troubling is that it reveals how our intuitions about combining losing propositions are fundamentally flawed, how we assume that negative expected values must always remain negative regardless of how they are mixed or sequenced, an assumption that proves dangerously incomplete when wealth-dependent probabilities enter the picture. The paradox has found applications in understanding biological systems, evolutionary processes, and even financial markets, suggesting that this principle might be far more prevalent in nature than we previously realized. We have spent centuries building economic and gambling theory on the foundation that losing games should always lose, that combining them in different orders or patterns changes nothing fundamental about their loss-making nature. Yet Parrondo's discovery reveals a hidden landscape of possibility beneath these seemingly solid principles, a reminder that even in domains we thought we fully understood, the interaction of multiple variables can produce entirely unexpected emergent behaviors. This discovery invites us to reconsider whether paradoxes are truly violations of logic or instead revelations that our models of reality were incomplete all along, missing crucial variables and dependencies that only become visible when we examine the intricate choreography of how systems interact over time. In this light, Parrondo's paradox becomes not a mathematical curiosity, but a humbling lesson in intellectual humility, that the universe may contain far more sophisticated mechanisms than our initial intuitions suggest, operating quietly beneath the surface of phenomena we thought we had already mastered. Imagine a city planner standing before a map of urban traffic, armed with data and conviction, proposing a solution that seems utterly counterintuitive: the removal of a major road that thousands of commuters use every single day. The proposal would be met with immediate and fierce resistance, yet history has shown us that in certain situations, taking away a road can actually make traffic flow faster for everyone involved. This phenomenon, known as Braess's paradox, is named after the German mathematician Dietrich Braess, who first proved mathematically in 1968 that adding extra capacity to a network, when individuals act in their own self-interest, can actually reduce the overall efficiency of that network. The practical implications of this discovery have manifested in real cities around the world, creating a situation where infrastructure removal paradoxically improves collective outcomes. In Seoul, South Korea, when the Chingyecheon elevated highway was removed in the year 2000 to restore an urban waterway, city planners braced themselves for traffic chaos and gridlock that never came. Instead, traffic flow improved throughout the region, and commuters found themselves arriving at their destinations faster despite the permanent loss of one of the city's major arteries. Similarly, in Stuttgart, Germany, when a road segment was closed for repairs, residents noticed that overall congestion actually decreased, leading city officials to make the closure permanent because the data showed unambiguously that traffic moved more smoothly without that particular route available. The mechanism operating beneath these counterintuitive outcomes lies in a principle of human behavior that might be called selfish optimization within constrained systems. When a new road opens, drivers begin using it because it offers what appears to be a shortcut or a faster alternative to their current route, and this seems entirely rational from an individual perspective. However, when many individuals simultaneously make this rational choice based on self-interest alone, they create a new equilibrium that is actually worse for everyone, including themselves. This is because the new road diverts traffic flow in unexpected ways, creating bottlenecks and congestion points that wouldn't have existed had drivers remained distributed across the original network. The paradox emerges specifically in situations where the network has what is called a bottleneck or a critical choke point, and when drivers have the freedom to choose their own routes based only on minimizing their own travel time, they collectively create a situation where the Nash equilibrium, the point at which no individual can improve their own situation without worsening someone else's, is actually inefficient from the perspective of overall system performance. When a road is removed, drivers are forced to redistribute themselves across remaining routes in a pattern that, while not optimal for each individual driver, produces a better outcome for the system as a whole. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating and deeply unsettling is how it reveals the gap between individual rationality and collective well-being, a gap that persists in our planning and decision-making even as evidence accumulates that it exists. Urban planners and government officials remain reluctant to implement road removal strategies, not because the mathematics are uncertain or the precedents lacking, but because the political cost of removing a road that people actively use feels intolerable, even when data suggests it will improve traffic. The intuitive appeal of more infrastructure equals better outcomes runs so deep in our collective consciousness that we struggle to believe evidence to the contrary. We have built entire systems of thought around the assumption that expansion and addition are inherently positive, that more options always lead to better results, and that removing something that exists is a form of failure or regression rather than optimization. Consider for a moment the peculiar inversion of difficulty that defines so much of human cognitive experience, a phenomenon that computer scientist Hans Moravec first articulated in the 1980s when he noticed something deeply counterintuitive about the nature of intelligence and skill. What we find is that the tasks which seem impossibly difficult to accomplish, the feats requiring tremendous intellectual power and abstract reasoning, are often far easier for machines to perform than the simple, seemingly trivial activities that any child can master without conscious thought. A computer can calculate 17 billion digits of pi in seconds, can play chess at a level that defeats the greatest human grandmasters, can solve differential equations that would require hours of human mental labor, yet that same computer struggles profoundly with tasks that a toddler accomplishes with casual ease. Recognizing a face in a cluttered photograph, walking across an uneven floor without falling, understanding a joke, or knowing when someone is being sarcastic. The mechanism underlying this paradox lies in the fundamental difference between how human intelligence evolved and how artificial intelligence operates. Our brains developed through millions of years of survival in the physical world, requiring us to instantly process sensory information, navigate three-dimensional space, recognize threats and opportunities, and interact with other humans through extraordinarily complex social reasoning. These abilities became so deeply embedded in our neural architecture that they now operate almost entirely outside our conscious awareness, requiring minimal mental effort despite their profound sophistication. Conversely, the explicit, abstract, symbolic reasoning that we experience as effortful and demanding, mathematical proof, logical argument, sequential problem-solving, represents only a relatively recent evolutionary acquisition, a thin layer of conscious deliberation layered atop our ancient instinctual systems. Machines, having been engineered from the ground up without this evolutionary heritage, find the abstract and symbolic tasks straightforward to mechanize through simple algorithms and rule-based systems. But they struggle desperately with the embodied, intuitive, pattern recognition tasks that our evolution spent eons perfecting. What makes Moravec's observation so persistently fascinating is that it fundamentally challenges our intuitions about what intelligence actually means and which capabilities should be considered more valuable or impressive. We have built an entire educational and professional system based on the assumption that the hard things, advanced mathematics, abstract reasoning, formal logic, represent the pinnacle of intellectual achievement, while the easy things, walking, talking, recognizing emotion in another person's face, are considered trivial or beneath serious academic consideration. Yet the paradox reveals that this hierarchy might be precisely backwards from the perspective of actual cognitive achievement. The easy tasks are, in a real sense, far more impressive feats of information processing than anything we typically reward in our institutions. Over the decades since Moravec first identified this phenomenon, we have continued to normalize and accept this paradoxical ordering of difficulty despite its conceptual incoherence, perhaps because acknowledging it would require fundamentally restructuring how we think about intelligence, education, and human value itself. We continue to celebrate those who excel at abstract reasoning while taking for granted the staggering accomplishment of anyone who can simply perceive and move through the world with fluid naturalness, even though the latter represents vastly more evolved and sophisticated biological computation. Imagine a situation where a factory owner in 19th century England discovers a revolutionary new steam engine that burns coal with remarkable efficiency, consuming perhaps 30% less fuel than the older models while producing the same amount of power and heat. And the owner, naturally pleased with this development, implements the new technology throughout the facility, expecting to see a dramatic reduction in coal consumption and operating costs. Yet something peculiar happens, something that defies the intuitive expectation that using less fuel to accomplish the same work would necessarily result in lower overall fuel consumption. Instead of burning less coal, the factory actually burns more coal than it did before, and this counterintuitive phenomenon, first systematically described and analyzed by the 19th century economist William Stanley Jevons, reveals a fundamental paradox about human economic behavior and resource consumption that challenges our most basic assumptions about efficiency and conservation. The mechanism behind this paradox operates through a deceptively simple economic principle. When something becomes more efficient and therefore cheaper to use, people tend to use it more, often far more than the savings achieved through efficiency improvements alone would suggest. The factory owner, now operating more efficient steam engines that produce power at a lower cost per unit, finds it economically rational to expand production, to run the machines for longer hours, to heat larger buildings, and to power additional equipment that would have been prohibitively expensive to operate with the older, less efficient engines. What was once a luxury becomes accessible, what was once marginal becomes economical, and the aggregate consumption of the resource actually increases despite each individual unit of production requiring less fuel. This phenomenon extends far beyond the industrial mills of Victorian England and manifests across nearly every sector of modern life, from transportation to lighting to heating and cooling, where improvements in efficiency consistently fail to reduce overall consumption and frequently result in greater absolute usage of the resource in question. Consider the automobile industry, where engines have become dramatically more fuel efficient over the decades, yet people drive substantially more miles than they did when vehicles were thirsty machines, and the overall consumption of petroleum has continued to rise despite remarkable improvements in miles per gallon. Or consider lighting, where the shift from incandescent bulbs to light-emitting diodes has made illumination extraordinarily cheap and efficient, yet people now light their homes more brightly, use decorative lighting more extensively, and leave lights on in ways they would never have done when each bulb consumed significant electricity and generated considerable heat. The psychological and economic justification for this behavior operates almost invisibly. Once a resource becomes cheaper, it ceases to feel scarce, and once it ceases to feel scarce, the incentive to use it conservatively diminishes, and we expand our usage to fill the newly available capacity and opportunity. This paradox persists and even intensifies in modern economies because efficiency improvements are consistently presented and perceived as solutions to resource scarcity and environmental challenges. Yet the mechanism by which humans respond to lower costs consistently undermines the conservation goals that motivated the efficiency improvements in the first place, creating a strange loop where our technological victories over resource constraints become themselves the mechanisms by which we consume more of those very resources. Imagine yourself sitting in a classroom, staring at a mathematics problem you have never encountered before, and your teacher asks you to solve it. In that moment, you face what appears to be an insurmountable logical barrier. If you already knew how to solve the problem, you would not need to learn it. Yet if you do not know how to solve it, how could you possibly recognize the solution when you find it or understand the correct answer when it is explained to you? This ancient paradox, first articulated by the Greek philosopher Meno in Plato's dialogue bearing his name, strikes at the very heart of human learning and knowledge acquisition. The paradox suggests that all learning is logically impossible, that the act of discovering something entirely new creates a fundamental contradiction in how we understand the acquisition of knowledge itself. When you encounter information completely foreign to your existing mental framework, you lack the conceptual scaffolding necessary to even recognize what you're looking for, let alone identify it when it appears before you. Yet despite this seemingly airtight logical argument, humans engage in learning constantly, absorbing new information, developing novel skills, and expanding our understanding of the world in ways that should theoretically be impossible according to Meno's reasoning. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests on a particular understanding of knowledge as an all-or-nothing proposition, where you either possess complete understanding of something or you possess no understanding whatsoever, with no meaningful middle ground or partial knowledge. When you learn anything new, you move through intermediate states of partial comprehension, building gradually from incomplete understanding toward fuller awareness. Yet Meno's original formulation does not adequately account for these transitional phases or the way that existing knowledge can serve as a foundation for recognizing and integrating new information. What remains peculiarly persistent about this paradox is how it continues to resonate across centuries despite our sophisticated modern understanding of learning theory, cognitive psychology, and the mechanisms of human development. We have normalized learning precisely because we refuse to accept the paradox's strict logical framework, instead embracing a more nuanced view of knowledge acquisition that permits gradual understanding and partial awareness as legitimate forms of knowing. Yet the paradox endures in our educational anxieties and our reluctance to begin learning something entirely foreign, suggesting that Meno's ancient worry about the logical impossibility of learning still echoes in our contemporary hesitation whenever we face the unknown. When a student sits frozen before a blank exam question, or when someone hesitates at the threshold of learning a new language despite desperately wanting to speak it, Meno's paradox transforms from abstract philosophy into lived experience. A moment where the logical impossibility of learning feels not like a curious riddle, but like a genuine obstacle to overcome. Perhaps this is precisely where learning truly begins, not in the comfortable space of what we already know, but in that vertiginous moment when we acknowledge the paradox and choose to act despite it. In choosing to learn despite the paradox, we discover that the impossibility Meno identified was never truly about logic at all, but rather about courage, the willingness to step into uncertainty and trust that understanding will crystallize through engagement rather than emerge fully formed from the outset. This reframing transforms learning from a paradoxical impossibility into what it has always actually been, an act of faith in our capacity to grow. That faith is validated every time we stumble through a foreign grammar lesson and suddenly a sentence clicks into place, or when a child's confused frown transforms into the radiant recognition of understanding, reminding us that learning was never logically impossible. It was always simply human. Imagine a young professional who has spent years climbing the corporate ladder with exceptional skill and dedication, someone whose talent is undeniable and whose potential seems limitless in the eyes of their peers and superiors. Yet this person remains trapped in a perpetual state of self-imposed limitation, constantly holding back their true abilities, their innovative ideas, and their most ambitious aspirations because they harbor a deeply rooted fear that if they were to truly succeed, if they were to rise too high and shine too brightly, something catastrophic would inevitably occur. This phenomenon, which we might call the Icarus deception paradox, reverses the ancient mythology in a peculiar and deeply human way. Rather than hubris causing a fall from the sky, it is the anticipation of a fall that prevents us from ever truly taking flight in the first place. The paradox operates on the principle that many individuals unconsciously believe there exists a natural ceiling to success and happiness in their lives, and that surpassing this threshold will trigger punishment, rejection, or some form of cosmic rebalancing that will strip away their gains and leave them worse off than before. This belief system develops through various psychological pathways, including childhood messages about not standing out too much, cultural narratives about the dangers of ambition, family dynamics where achievement was met with criticism or withdrawal of love, or even survivor's guilt and the observation that successful people often face increased scrutiny and vulnerability. The deception at the heart of this paradox lies in the fact that the person is not being held back by external forces or legitimate obstacles, but rather by an internalized prediction of failure that has never actually materialized, and yet this imagined consequence becomes real enough to alter their behavior, suppress their output, and ultimately create the very mediocrity they feared would follow success. The mechanism functions almost like a self-imposed glass ceiling that the individual believes they are reading rather than creating, maintaining the illusion that they are being cautious rather than self-sabotaging. What makes this paradox particularly persistent in our modern world is that it operates beneath conscious awareness, disguised as prudence or realism, and because the feared catastrophe never occurs, the individual never accumulates evidence that contradicts their belief, instead only finding confirmation that their restraint was necessary and wise. The paradox reinforces itself endlessly, a closed loop of suppression and false validation. The person who declines a promotion tells themselves they're being realistic about their capabilities. The artist who doesn't submit their work interprets their hesitation as good judgment, and the entrepreneur who abandons their venture sees it as prudent risk management, each mistake becoming evidence that holding back was the right choice, each unlived dream a bullet dodged rather than an opportunity missed. In this way, the Icarus deception transforms restraint into wisdom and calls self-imprisonment caution. The cruelest irony is that the person never discovers their actual ceiling, never learns what they might have achieved, and thus lives in permanent thrall to a phantom limitation, a fear so successful at its job that it never needs to prove itself real. The tragedy compounds when we consider all the innovations never created, the lives never touched, and the potential never realized, all sacrificed on the altar of a catastrophe that existed only in imagination. Yet perhaps the deepest deception of all is that we mistake this self-imposed restraint for humility, when in truth it is a form of spiritual cowardice, a refusal to accept that our wings were always meant to carry us higher, and that the only real fall we risk is the one we orchestrate by never learning to fly at all. Imagine listening to two musical notes that seem to ascend endlessly upward, climbing higher and higher in pitch with each progression, yet somehow you never actually reach a higher note than where you began, a phenomenon that defies the very logic of how sound and human perception should interact with one another. This is the Tritone paradox, discovered by psychologist Diana Deutsch in 1986, a discovery that revealed something genuinely strange about how our brains process musical information and construct reality from ambiguous acoustic signals. When you hear a pair of notes separated by a tritone interval, which is 6 semitones on the musical scale, something remarkable happens within your auditory system and your brain's interpretation of that sound. Tritone is acoustically ambiguous in a way that few other musical intervals are, because while it contains frequency information that could logically belong to either a higher or lower octave, depending on how your brain chooses to interpret the overtone series, your mind must make a choice about which direction the music is moving, and different people make different choices based on their own individual exposure to music and their linguistic background, and even the hand dominance they were born with. When Deutsch first presented this illusion to listeners, she discovered that roughly half of all people perceived the notes as ascending, while the other half perceived them as descending, even though they were listening to the identical musical sequence. A truly remarkable demonstration of how subjective our supposedly objective sensory experiences actually are. The paradox deepens when you realize that the tritone has been historically called the devil's interval by medieval musicians and theorists, banned from musical composition in certain periods of European history because it was considered dissonant and unsettling, creating an uncanny sense of tension that violated the harmonic rules that govern proper music. And yet this acoustic devil's interval reveals something profound about the nature of perception itself. The mechanism behind this illusion operates at the intersection of physics and psychology, because while the actual sound waves contain all the information needed to determine pitch unambiguously, your brain must interpret these waves in the context of what it expects to hear, and what patterns it has learned to recognize through years of exposure to musical language and cultural conventions. The tritone creates an illusion because each note in the sequence contains multiple overtones and harmonics that could belong to different octaves, and your brain essentially makes a guess about which interpretation is correct, filling in the gaps with its own assumptions about how music typically behaves. What makes this particular paradox so psychologically fascinating is that it demonstrates how much of what we experience as direct sensory perception is actually constructed interpretation, a constant negotiation between the raw data our ears receive and the expectations our brains carry based on learning and experience. And this becomes especially evident when people listen to the tritone paradox repeatedly and discover that their perception can shift or flip to the opposite direction. The tritone musical illusion persists as a genuine phenomenon despite our intellectual understanding of how it works, suggesting that knowledge about an illusion does not necessarily free us from experiencing it, that we cannot simply choose to perceive differently once our brain has committed to an interpretation, even when we know logically that alternative interpretations exist and are equally valid given the acoustic information available. This paradox has become a subject of ongoing research in music cognition, neuroscience, and psychology precisely because it reveals something fundamental about the constructed nature of human perception and demonstrates that even in the realm of something as seemingly objective as musical pitch, our subjective experience is deeply mediated by cultural learning and individual neural architecture. Imagine a billionaire approaches you with an unusual proposition. He will give you $1 million, but only if you form the intention to drink a deadly toxin that will make you violently ill for several hours, though it will not kill you or cause any permanent harm. The catch is that you only need to intend to drink it. You do not actually have to drink it. The money transfers to your account the moment you genuinely decide that you will consume the toxin, and then you are free to change your mind and never actually drink it. The toxin has no antidote, so there is no way to protect yourself once you have drunk it. The billionaire has a foolproof method of detecting whether your intention is genuine or merely pretended, so you cannot fake your way through this puzzle. The question becomes deceptively simple. Can you form the sincere intention to drink the toxin, knowing that you will become extremely ill if you actually follow through, and knowing that you have nothing to gain by actually drinking it once the money is already in your possession? This puzzle reveals a peculiar gap in human rationality that philosophers have grappled with for decades. On the surface, the logical solution seems obvious: form the intention, collect the money, and then simply decide not to drink the toxin. Your future self will have no rational reason to drink it, since you will already have the reward, and drinking it would only bring suffering. Yet most people find themselves unable to form this intention genuinely, even though they understand the logic perfectly well. The problem lies in the nature of intention itself and how our minds distinguish between authentic commitment and mere wishful thinking. When you genuinely intend to do something, that intention carries a kind of internal gravity. It shapes your expectations about your own future behavior. If you truly intend to drink the toxin, your brain begins preparing you for that future reality, and the prospect becomes increasingly unbearable. Your rational mind understands that you will not actually drink it, but your emotional and psychological systems begin reacting as though you really will, because that is what genuine intention requires. The deeper mechanism at work involves what philosophers call the problem of prior intention and instrumental rationality. Your intention to drink the toxin cannot be merely instrumental. It cannot be a tool or a step toward getting money, because once the money is secured, that instrumentality evaporates. The intention must become an end in itself, at least temporarily, and this is precisely where human psychology stumbles. We are not designed to genuinely intend actions that serve no rational purpose and would cause us harm. The very act of forming a sincere intention creates psychological tension because you are committing yourself to something that your reasoning mind simultaneously recognizes as irrational. This is why the puzzle persists as genuinely difficult, despite having a logically valid solution. It exposes a fundamental truth about human agency. Our intentions are not simply mental states that we can construct and deconstruct at will, like moving game pieces on a board. Instead, intentions are deeply embedded in our emotional, psychological, and physiological systems. When we commit to something genuinely, we are not just thinking about it, we are restructuring our entire being around that commitment. What makes Kafka's Toxin puzzle so psychologically arresting is that it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that rationality alone cannot solve all human problems, and that the gap between logical understanding and psychological capacity is wider than we often admit. We persist in this inability to form the necessary intention precisely because our minds are wiser than pure logic in certain respects, even when we do not fully understand why. The puzzle continues to haunt us not because we cannot find the answer, but because finding the answer and being able to act on it are two entirely different things. Imagine you are standing in a library late at night, surrounded by countless books written throughout human history, and you begin to contemplate a simple question. If something is true, is it possible to know that it is true? This seemingly innocent inquiry opens a door to one of the most perplexing paradoxes in contemporary philosophy, one that challenges our very understanding of what truth means and what it means for something to be knowable. Fitch's knowability paradox, formulated by philosopher Friedrich Fitch in 1945, presents us with a logical argument that appears to prove something deeply counterintuitive. That if there exists any truth that nobody will ever know, then there cannot be any truths that are in principle unknowable. The paradox works through a deceptively straightforward chain of logical reasoning that begins with a seemingly reasonable assumption, that any truth is, at least in theory, capable of being known by someone at some point in time. From this premise, Fitch constructs an argument showing that if we accept this principle, we are forced to conclude that every true statement must actually be known by someone, which would mean that there are no unknown truths whatsoever. The mechanism that makes this paradox so troubling is its reliance on the principle of knowability itself, which states that if something is true, then it is possible for it to be known. When we combine this with basic logical operations, particularly the notion that we can know conjunctions of facts, the paradox demonstrates that the existence of any unknown truth creates an immediate logical contradiction. Consider a statement like, "It is raining outside, but nobody knows it is raining," which seems perfectly coherent in everyday experience. Yet according to Fitch's reasoning, if this statement were true and knowable in principle, then someone could in theory come to know that the statement is true, which would mean they would know both that it is raining and that nobody knows it is raining, thereby creating a logical impossibility, since someone would then know it is raining. This recursive trap reveals how the assumption of universal knowability collapses when confronted with the reality of unknown truths. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating is how it persists in philosophical discourse despite the logical pressures it creates, forcing philosophers and logicians to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the nature of truth, knowledge, and possibility. Some philosophers have suggested that we must abandon the principle of knowability entirely, accepting that some truths may be eternally beyond human knowledge, while others propose that we must revise our understanding of what it means for something to be possible to know, perhaps suggesting that possibility itself is relative to a particular person's epistemic position rather than abstract and universal. The paradox has normalized a profound uncertainty about the structure of reality itself, suggesting that our intuitions about truth and knowledge may be fundamentally at odds with the logical consequences of our own philosophical commitments, leaving us in a state of productive confusion about what we can ever really hope to understand. Yet perhaps this is the paradox's greatest gift. By forcing us to confront the limits of what we can know about knowledge itself, it teaches us intellectual humility, reminding us that the architecture of truth may be far stranger and more elusive than our logical systems can fully capture, and that some of philosophy's deepest insights emerge not from solving its puzzles, but from learning to live thoughtfully within them. In the late 1990s, a psychological research team conducted a series of experiments examining how humans respond to statistically improbable threats, and during the course of their work, they discovered something peculiar about the way we process danger involving large predators in unexpected contexts. The researchers asked participants to imagine themselves in various scenarios, one of which involved being in a suburban shopping mall when, quite suddenly and without explanation, a tiger escaped from a traveling circus and began roaming freely through the corridors between stores. The participants were asked to rate their level of fear on a numerical scale, and nearly all of them reported elevated anxiety responses, despite the fact that tigers have never, in recorded history, appeared in North American shopping malls in any significant numbers, and the actual probability of such an event occurring approaches zero for any individual person in their lifetime. What became apparent through continued research was that the human brain does not calculate threat probability in a purely logical manner, but instead generates emotional responses based on the vividness and memorability of the scenario itself, combined with our intrinsic evolutionary awareness that tigers are, in fact, dangerous animals. The mechanism operates through what psychologists call the availability heuristic, a mental shortcut where we judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind, rather than actual statistical frequency. And since tigers are culturally prominent creatures that appear in stories, films, and collective memory as apex predators, our brains treat the threat as more real than the actual data would suggest. What makes this paradox particularly interesting is that participants simultaneously held two contradictory beliefs. Understanding intellectually that tiger attacks in shopping malls are virtually impossible, while simultaneously experiencing genuine physiological anxiety responses to the imagined scenario, as if their emotional systems had not received the memo about probability. This persistent disconnect reveals that human consciousness contains multiple layers of processing that do not always communicate perfectly with one another, and we navigate the world constantly in this state of fractured awareness where our learned statistics and our evolutionary instincts exist in perpetual disagreement. We have normalized this internal contradiction so thoroughly that we rarely pause to notice it, accepting without question that we can simultaneously believe something is safe and feel that it is dangerous, much like how we understand statistically that commercial airline flight is extraordinarily safe, yet many people experience anxiety during takeoff, or how we know that the vast majority of strangers mean us no harm, yet we still feel cautious when walking alone at night. The unexpected tiger paradox ultimately reveals not a flaw in human reasoning, but rather the coexistence of multiple valid systems for processing reality, systems that evolve to serve different purposes and that do not always reach the same conclusions about what warrants our attention and concern. Understanding this paradox may ultimately be less about resolving the conflict between our rational and emotional minds and more about recognizing that both systems contain wisdom. The statistical mind protects us from paralysis by calculating true frequencies, while the visceral mind keeps us alert to genuine dangers that statistics alone cannot always predict. And perhaps the goal is not to silence one voice in favor of the other, but to develop the metacognitive skill of knowing which system to trust in each specific context we encounter. A tiger in a shopping mall remains statistically impossible, yet the fear it generates is neurologically real, and this distinction matters. It suggests that our anxiety responses are not errors to be corrected, but rather signals worth decoding, invitations to examine what our emotional systems are trying to protect us from even when our rational minds insist there is nothing to fear. Consider the peculiar social phenomenon wherein we speak of ending another person's life through methods we have deemed acceptable, humane, or even merciful, yet the act itself remains fundamentally unchanged in its outcome, the permanent cessation of a human being's existence. This is the gentle murder paradox, a contradiction that exists most prominently in conversations surrounding euthanasia, capital punishment administered with clinical precision, or the withdrawal of life support from the terminally ill. We have constructed an elaborate linguistic and ethical framework that allows us to distinguish between killing and mercy killing, between execution and justice, between letting someone die and actively ending their life, yet the biological reality remains singular and absolute. A person is dead either way, their consciousness extinguished, their potential futures erased, and no amount of terminology or procedural gentleness changes this fundamental fact. The mechanism underlying this paradox is rooted in our psychological need to maintain moral coherence while simultaneously accepting uncomfortable necessities. We are creatures who require narrative structure to justify our actions, and so we have developed the concept of harm reduction, proportional response, and compassionate termination. We tell ourselves that if we can make the process painless, swift, and surrounded by appropriate ceremony or legal framework, then perhaps the outcome becomes less categorically wrong. We examine the quality of life, the absence of alternatives, the suffering being prevented, and we weigh these against the absolute nature of death itself. The paradox deepens when we recognize that society permits certain forms of gentle death while forbidding others, suggesting that the gentleness itself is not truly the determining factor in our moral calculus. We allow physicians to discontinue life support for comatose patients while criminalizing a similar outcome when requested by a conscious individual. We execute criminals with lethal injection designed to minimize suffering, yet we would never tolerate such a procedure for any other purpose. This selective application reveals that the gentleness serves primarily as an anesthetic for our collective conscience rather than as a logical resolution to the underlying contradiction. What persists most strikingly is our ability to compartmentalize these conversations, to discuss gentle murder as though the juxtaposition of those two words does not create an irreconcilable tension within rational thought. We have normalized the paradox through repetition and institutional acceptance, allowing it to settle into the background of medical ethics and legal proceedings as though it represents something solved rather than something perpetually unresolved. The contradiction remains, quiet and undisturbed, a gentle paradox that we have learned to live alongside without ever truly confronting its essential nature. Perhaps this is precisely why we continue to refine the methods and language rather than abandon the practice entirely. Because confronting the paradox directly would require us to accept that some moral contradictions cannot be resolved through gentleness alone, only endured through the acceptance that certain acts exist beyond the reach of our most carefully constructed justifications. And yet we persist in this endurance, refining protocols and terminology with each passing decade, as though the next iteration of gentleness might finally dissolve the paradox we have made peace with, a peace built not on resolution, but on our collective agreement to stop asking whether mercy and death can ever truly be reconciled, or whether we simply prefer the comfort of the question left suspended in perpetuity. In this suspended state, we find comfort in the rituals themselves, the waiting periods, the appeals processes, the ethics committees, mechanisms that allow us to believe we are exercising restraint even as we move inexorably toward the predetermined outcome, converting bureaucratic delay into moral deliberation. Consider the peculiar situation that emerges when a parent discovers that their young child has ingested something potentially poisonous, perhaps a bottle of cleaning solution or a handful of unknown berries found in the yard, and in that moment of panic, the parent's immediate instinct is to call poison control or rush to the emergency room. Yet simultaneously there exists within them a strange and counterintuitive thought pattern wherein they begin to wonder whether their child might have somehow intentionally poisoned themselves, despite the child being far too young to understand the concept of poison, to read warning labels, or to possess the cognitive ability to form such a deliberate and dangerous intention. This mental trap, which we might call the toxin intention problem, represents a fascinating intersection between our need to establish causality and our tendency to attribute agency and intentionality to events that are almost certainly accidental and random. The mechanism that creates this paradox operates in several layers simultaneously, beginning with our deeply ingrained psychological requirement to understand why things happen, to locate blame or responsibility, because randomness and accident feel more terrifying than intention, since intention at least implies some understandable pattern or motive we might eventually comprehend or prevent. When something harmful occurs, the brain desperately seeks an explanation, and in seeking that explanation, it sometimes generates narratives that assign intentionality even to creatures and situations where intentionality is neurologically or developmentally impossible, as if the act of having a reason, any reason at all, would somehow be less distressing than acknowledging that terrible things simply occur without warning or purpose. Furthermore, this problem deepens when we consider how modern parenting culture and media narratives have conditioned us to suspect danger, to worry about poisoning attempts or deliberate harm, so thoroughly that even when our rational mind knows a toddler cannot intentionally poison themselves, some portion of our consciousness still generates suspicious thoughts, as if the very fact that something dangerous occurred automatically implies that someone must have wanted it to happen. That the universe operates on intention rather than probability. What makes this paradox particularly persistent is that it carries no logical foundation whatsoever, yet it continues to manifest in the minds of otherwise rational adults who understand developmental psychology and probability, suggesting that our need for intentional explanations overrides our logical understanding of how causation actually works, and we persist in this strange mental habit even when we're fully aware it serves no protective function and explains nothing. Remaining trapped in this cycle of attributing intention to accident simply because the alternative, accepting that harm occurs randomly and unpredictably, feels psychologically unbearable. Yet perhaps this reveals something profound about human consciousness itself, that we would rather live in a world where terrible things happen for reasons we might control or understand than in one where safety is merely an illusion maintained by probability, where our vigilance and intention cannot ultimately protect us from a universe fundamentally indifferent to our children's well-being. This is perhaps why the parent who knows rationally that their child cannot have intentionally poisoned themselves will still, in the dark hours of that night, lie awake constructing elaborate narratives of how it might have happened deliberately, not because they believe these narratives, but because the act of narrating intention itself, of imagining motive, method, and agency, temporarily restores a sense of control that random accident has stripped away, transforming a terrifying accident into a preventable tragedy, and prevention, however illusory, feels like a form of safety. Imagine a world where the poorest members of society face an economic paradox so counterintuitive that it seems to violate the basic laws of supply and demand that we learned in school. And picture yourself as someone living in 19th century Ireland during times of terrible famine and economic hardship, where bread represents not merely a food item, but the fundamental foundation of survival itself. When the price of bread increased dramatically due to crop failures and scarcity, something extraordinary happened that defied conventional economic logic. The poorest families actually bought more bread rather than less, even as their already meager budgets became increasingly strained and squeezed by the rising costs. This phenomenon, named after economist Robert Giffen, who observed it occurring during the Irish famine, represents a fundamental exception to the law of demand that textbooks present as universal and immutable. The mechanism driving this paradoxical behavior emerges from the desperate circumstances of extreme poverty, where bread occupies such a dominant position in the household diet that it becomes what economists call an inferior good. When bread prices rose, families who had previously been able to afford small quantities of supplementary foods like meat, butter, or vegetables found themselves unable to purchase these luxuries any longer, and therefore they redirected whatever meager resources remained toward buying additional bread to replace the calories they could no longer obtain elsewhere. As the price climbed higher and their purchasing power diminished, they bought more of the essential commodity and less of everything else, creating a situation where demand increased as price increased, reversing the downward slope of a typical demand curve and producing what we call a Giffen good. The psychological and emotional dimensions of this paradox reveal how human behavior under conditions of scarcity operates according to survival priorities rather than rational economic optimization, where the mind comprehends instinctively that bread must be secured above all else because the alternative is starvation itself. We find this phenomenon persists as a theoretical concept in economics education, not because it remains prevalent in modern developed nations, but because it exposes the hidden assumptions underlying our economic models, assumptions that presume sufficient income levels where luxury goods exist as viable alternatives to staple foods. The normalization of this paradox within academic discourse reflects our distance from the conditions of absolute poverty, allowing us to study it as an intellectual curiosity rather than an immediate threat to survival. Yet somewhere in the world today, families in conditions of extreme deprivation may still experience versions of this phenomenon where the most essential items become paradoxically more demanded as their prices increase and alternatives disappear entirely. In developing nations where staple crops like rice, potatoes, or cassava command similar dominance in household consumption patterns, economists continue to debate whether true Giffen goods genuinely exist, or whether the phenomenon represents a rare historical artifact of extreme poverty that modern safety nets and income diversity have largely eliminated. What remains undeniable is that the Giffen good serves as a humbling reminder that economic laws are not universal constants, but rather descriptions of behavior under specific conditions, and that human survival instincts can override the rational actor assumptions upon which entire economic systems are built. The story of the Giffen good thus becomes not merely an economic footnote, but a profound meditation on how poverty reshapes the fundamental relationship between price, demand, and human choice, reminding us that behind every economic principle lies the lived experience of real people making impossible decisions with impossible constraints. Imagine a family sitting in their home on a sweltering summer evening in Texas, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and distorts your thinking. Someone suggests, almost casually, that they all drive together to Abilene, a distant town nearly 50 miles away, to have dinner at a restaurant they have heard about but none of them have visited. The drive will be long and uncomfortable, the restaurant is uncertain, and nobody really wants to go, yet they all agree to the plan and proceed to pile into a car together for what becomes an exhausting and ultimately disappointing journey. When they finally return home, frustrated and tired, someone asks why they went in the first place, and each family member admits separately that they had not actually wanted to go at all, that they only agreed because they thought the others wanted to go, creating a paradox where a group takes collective action that nobody in the group actually desired. This peculiar scenario is called the Abilene Group Agreement, named after Jerry Harvey's 1974 observation of this exact phenomenon, and it represents a profound breakdown in communication and individual authenticity that occurs within social groups of all sizes and contexts. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox is rooted in several interconnected human tendencies that operate beneath our conscious awareness. People have a fundamental desire to maintain harmony within their group and to avoid conflict, even when that harmony is built entirely upon misunderstanding and mutual deception. When someone proposes an action, others may feel pressure to conform to what they perceive as the group's emerging consensus, assuming that silence or agreement indicates genuine enthusiasm rather than passive acceptance or hidden objection. There is also a phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance, where each individual in a group mistakenly believes that everyone else holds different opinions or preferences than they actually do, creating a feedback loop where people suppress their true preferences in favor of what they imagine others want. Additionally, the presence of uncertainty and the reluctance to be the first person to voice dissent create a cascade effect, where initial agreement makes subsequent disagreement increasingly difficult, as doing so would require someone to openly contradict the apparent collective will and risk being perceived as difficult, selfish, or not a team player. What makes the Abilene Group Agreement so particularly fascinating as a paradox is that it represents a form of collective irrationality that persists despite having absolutely no logical foundation, and despite the fact that everyone involved is capable of rational thought and honest communication. Organizations, families, and social groups continue to undertake projects, make decisions, and pursue directions that no individual member actually supports, wasting time, resources, and emotional energy on endeavors that could have been abandoned or modified with a single honest voice. We have normalized this peculiar dynamic so thoroughly that it often goes unnoticed, with people attributing their dissatisfaction to external circumstances rather than recognizing the communication failure at its core. The paradox endures because speaking up requires courage that most people reserve for situations they perceive as genuinely important, yet in doing so, we collectively create a world where our shared experiences are characterized by quiet resentment rather than authentic connection, where we spend our limited time doing things none of us want to do simply because we cannot muster the vulnerability required to say so. The antidote to this pattern lies not in some grand organizational overhaul, but in the simple, terrifying act of one person asking directly, "Does anyone actually want to do this?" and then creating space for honest answers without judgment or pressure to conform. Imagine a small town committee tasked with deciding which public project to fund: a new library, a community swimming pool, or improved street lighting. 3 equally qualified proposals exist, and the committee members have genuine preferences for each. The moderator asks them to vote, expecting a clear winner to emerge, but something peculiar happens instead. When library is compared directly against the pool, the library wins by a narrow margin. When the pool is compared directly against street lighting, the pool wins with similar conviction. Yet when library is compared directly against street lighting wins decisively. The committee finds itself trapped in what appears to be a logical impossibility, where no single option can claim legitimate majority support when all 3 are considered together. This phenomenon is known as the Condorcet voting cycle, named after the 18th century French mathematician and philosopher Marie-Jean-Antoine Nicolas de Caratat, Marquis de Condorcet, who first identified this troubling flaw in democratic decision-making. The mechanism underlying this paradox lies in the nature of preference aggregation and the multidimensional nature of human values. Each committee member ranks the three options differently based on their own priorities. Perhaps one person values education and recreation equally but cares less about infrastructure, another prioritizes safety and maintenance, while a third wants visible community development. When individual preferences are mathematically combined through pairwise comparisons, the collective ranking does not necessarily exhibit the transitivity that we intuitively expect from rational choice. If most people prefer A to B, and most people prefer B to C, logic suggests most should prefer A to C, yet this is precisely where the cycle breaks down. The preferences themselves are not irrational at the individual level, yet their aggregation produces a circular outcome where no stable majority preference can be determined. What makes this paradox particularly insidious is that it reveals a fundamental limitation in democratic theory itself, one that we have largely normalized and accommodated rather than resolved. We have become accustomed to accepting election results, committee decisions, and policy outcomes that may themselves represent voting cycles masked by procedural mechanisms like plurality voting or runoff systems. These methods don't eliminate the cycle, they merely hide it behind the appearance of decisive outcomes. The voting method itself becomes the hidden arbiter of outcomes, determining winners not through genuine collective preference, but through the structural biases embedded in how we count and compare votes. Understanding this cycle transforms how we might approach democratic decision-making, suggesting that perfect consensus may be mathematically impossible rather than merely difficult to achieve. Rather than abandoning democratic processes, this recognition invites us to design voting systems with explicit awareness of their limitations, choosing methods that optimize for transparency and fairness even when perfection remains elusive. The Condorcet cycle ultimately teaches us that the search for the true will of the people may be less important than building institutions honest about their own constraints. Such honesty might paradoxically strengthen democratic legitimacy, as citizens recognize that their representatives are navigating genuinely intractable problems rather than applying some hidden formula that mysteriously transforms conflicting desires into singular mandates. In this light, the Condorcet cycle becomes not a bug to be fixed, but a feature to be managed, a reminder that governance is fundamentally about negotiation among incommensurable values rather than the discovery of predetermined truths. When we accept this premise, we might find ourselves more patient with the messiness of democratic deliberation, recognizing that extended debate and compromise are not failures of the system, but necessary responses to genuine logical constraints that no voting method can fully escape. Imagine you are presented with two urns, each containing 100 balls that are either red or black, and you will draw one ball from whichever urn you choose, winning money if you draw red. With the first urn, you know with absolute certainty that exactly 50 balls are red and 50 are black, giving you a clear 50% chance of winning. With the second urn, you know that it contains 100 balls that are some combination of red and black, but you have no information whatsoever about the exact proportion, meaning the probability could be anywhere from 0% to 100% red. When researchers ask people which urn they would prefer to draw from, the overwhelming majority consistently choose the first urn with known odds, even though mathematically, both urns offer identical expected value if the unknown urn is equally likely to contain any ratio of colors. This phenomenon is called Ellsberg ambiguity aversion, named after economist Daniel Ellsberg, who first described it in 1961, and it represents a fundamental deviation from rational decision-making theory that persists across cultures, education levels, and contexts. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox emerges from our deep-seated need for certainty and our tendency to fear what we cannot quantify or predict. When we face ambiguity, our brains experience a kind of cognitive discomfort, a mental friction that makes uncertain probabilities feel worse than known probabilities, even when the actual risks are identical. We seem to interpret missing information as a threat rather than as a neutral unknown, and this negativity bias causes us to heavily discount options where we lack confidence in our probability estimates. The aversion becomes even stronger when the stakes increase, suggesting that our emotional response to ambiguity intensifies proportionally with how much we stand to lose or gain. What makes this paradox particularly persistent in human behavior is that it survives despite decades of education, financial literacy campaigns, and exposure to rational choice theory itself. Insurance companies exploit this tendency when they price policies with a premium for unknown risks that people perceive as more dangerous than statistically equivalent known risks. Investors demonstrate ambiguity aversion when they concentrate their portfolios in familiar domestic stocks rather than diversifying into international markets where they have less information about regulatory environments and economic conditions. Hiring managers display this same pattern when they favor candidates from prestigious universities, where credential standards are transparent, over equally qualified candidates from less famous institutions. The paradox persists because our emotional and intuitive decision-making systems evolved in environments where ambiguity truly was dangerous, where encountering something you could not understand or predict posed genuine survival threats, and that ancient neural wiring still guides our choices in modern contexts where such caution no longer serves us. We have normalized this irrational preference so thoroughly that we barely notice it operating, building entire institutions and markets around the assumption that people will always pay a premium for certainty, even when that certainty is illusory or when the unknown option is statistically superior. The tragedy is that this preference for false certainty often prevents us from pursuing genuinely better opportunities. The diversified portfolio that would have yielded superior returns, the talented hire whose unconventional background might have transformed the organization, the medical treatment with promising but incompletely understood mechanisms that could have saved a life. In essence, ambiguity aversion transforms our greatest cognitive strength, the ability to recognize and respect the limits of our knowledge, into a systematic blindness to possibilities that refuse to fit neatly into our existing frameworks of understanding. Imagine yourself facing a choice that seems straightforward on the surface, yet contains a hidden contradiction within your own preferences. In 1953, the economist Maurice Allais presented a puzzle to decision makers that would reveal something profound about how we value certainty itself. The paradox works like this. You are offered two different gambles, and in the first scenario, you must choose between a certain prize of $1 million with absolute guaranteed certainty, or you may instead take a gamble where you have a 99% chance of winning $1 million but a 1% chance of winning nothing at all. Most people choose the certain million, which seems rational because the expected value is nearly identical, but the psychological comfort of certainty feels worth the tiny difference. However, when Allais then presents a second scenario, where you must choose between a 99% chance of winning $1 million with a 1% chance of winning nothing, or an alternative where you have a 90% chance of winning $1 million with a 10% chance of winning nothing, suddenly people's preferences flip in a way that directly contradicts their first choice. If you truly preferred certainty in the first scenario, your mathematics should remain consistent in the second scenario, yet it does not. The psychological mechanism operating beneath this reversal is the asymmetrical weight we place on certainty itself, separate from the actual probability mathematics involved. When something is certain, our brains treat it as categorically different from something merely probable, even if the numerical difference is minuscule. This creates what psychologists call the certainty effect, where we overvalue guaranteed outcomes and undervalue probable ones in ways that violate the rational consistency we expect from ourselves. The reason this paradox persists in human decision-making is that our evolutionary heritage equipped us with heuristics designed for survival in small groups with immediate consequences, not for navigating complex probabilistic scenarios with abstract financial amounts. We have normalized this contradiction by accepting that humans are simply not perfectly rational economic agents, yet we rarely examine how this inconsistency reveals something deeper about how our brains fundamentally categorize risk and reward. Understanding this quirk matters because it shapes decisions far beyond gambling. It explains why people overpay for insurance, why they resist investing in diversified portfolios despite superior expected returns, and why organizations cling to established but mediocre strategies rather than pursuing riskier innovations with higher potential payoffs. The certainty effect is not a flaw to be corrected so much as a feature of human cognition that we must learn to recognize and navigate with deliberate awareness. When we recognize that certainty itself carries psychological weight independent of probability, we gain the leverage to examine our own choices more honestly, asking not whether a decision feels safe, but whether that feeling of safety is actually serving our interests or merely our anxiety. The next time you face a choice between the guaranteed and the probable, notice where your instinct pulls you, and ask yourself whether you are making a decision based on mathematics or based on the ancient part of your mind that still remembers what it felt like to choose safety over everything else. That ancient part of your mind is not wrong, it kept your ancestors alive. But in a world where survival often depends on taking calculated risks with uncertain outcomes, recognizing when certainty is an illusion becomes as important as recognizing when it is genuinely within reach. The paradox ultimately teaches us that consistency in our values matters less than understanding why we hold them, and whether the certainty we chase is a rational anchor or merely a comfortable illusion we mistake for wisdom. Imagine a molecular string so long and complex that if it were to randomly explore every possible configuration it could adopt, it would take longer than the age of the universe to find the correct three-dimensional shape. And yet somehow, in the warm, aqueous environment of your cells right now, proteins are folding themselves into their precise functional forms in mere seconds or minutes at most. This is the Levinthal paradox, named after the scientist Cyrus Levinthal, who first articulated this troubling observation in the 1960s, and it describes one of the most fundamental mysteries of biochemistry that continues to perplex researchers even as we have learned more and more about the molecular mechanisms involved. When we consider the sheer mathematical space of possibilities available to a protein chain containing hundreds or thousands of amino acids, each one capable of rotating in different directions and adopting different angles relative to its neighbors, the combinatorial explosion becomes almost incomprehensibly vast, creating what we might call a conformational landscape so expansive that random searching through it would be utterly futile. And yet proteins do fold, reliably and repeatedly, suggesting that there must be something fundamentally different about how nature actually solves this problem compared to what our initial mathematical intuitions might suggest about the situation. The mechanism that appears to underlie this apparent miracle involves the concept of a folding funnel, a metaphorical visualization of how the energy landscape of a protein is not actually a flat, featureless plane where every path is equally likely, but rather a topological surface shaped like an inverted cone where the protein chain naturally rolls downhill through thermodynamic favoring, following guiding principles encoded in the amino acid sequence itself. The hydrophobic effect, entropy considerations, hydrogen bonding patterns, and electrostatic interactions all work in concert to bias the exploration of conformational space toward productive pathways rather than trapping the molecule in random tangles. And this biasing is so effective that what initially seemed like an impossibly large search problem becomes, through the clever geometry of chemistry, a navigable process where incorrect conformations are energetically penalized while the correct native state remains energetically favored. Yet despite our increasingly sophisticated understanding of these principles, the phenomenon still retains something paradoxical about it, because the full details of how every individual protein folds still cannot be predicted from first principles alone, and we remain dependent on experimental observation and computational simulation to understand the complete kinetic pathways that different proteins actually traverse during their folding journeys. Modern approaches like molecular dynamic simulations and artificial intelligence systems, such as AlphaFold, have begun to crack this problem by learning the statistical patterns embedded in evolutionary sequences. Yet they ultimately succeed not by solving the combinatorial explosion directly, but by leveraging the same thermodynamic principles that nature discovered billions of years ago, reminding us that the paradox was never truly about impossibility, but rather about the profound elegance of how chemistry constrains possibility. The folding of hemoglobin, insulin, and the prion proteins that misfold in neurodegenerative diseases all testify to this principle. That understanding protein folding is not merely an academic exercise, but a key to comprehending health, disease, and the very chemistry of life itself, making Levinthal's paradox not a puzzle to be solved, but a gateway to appreciating the breathtaking efficiency of biological systems. Consider the seemingly impossible phenomenon where hot water freezes faster than cold water, a counterintuitive reality that has puzzled scientists and philosophers for centuries, creating what we now call the Mpemba effect, named after the Tanzanian student Erasto Mpemba, who rediscovered this curious property in the 1960s. Though the observation itself traces back to Aristotle and other ancient scholars who noted this strange behavior without adequate explanation. When you place two identical containers of water into a freezer, one filled with hot water and the other with cold water, conventional physics would suggest that the cold water should solidify first, reaching the freezing point more quickly since it requires less energy lost to transition into ice. Yet repeatedly and reproducibly, the hot water often crystallizes before its cooler counterpart, defying our intuitive understanding of thermodynamics and heat transfer. The mechanism behind this paradox involves several overlapping physical processes that work in concert to accelerate the freezing of the hotter sample, beginning with the phenomenon of evaporation, where hot water loses mass as vapor escapes from its surface at a much greater rate than cold water, thereby reducing the total volume that must be cooled and requiring less total energy removal to reach the freezing point. Additionally, hot water exhibits different convection patterns within the container, where warmer fluid rises while cooler fluid sinks, creating more efficient mixing and heat distribution that paradoxically allows heat to escape more readily from the system compared to the stratified layers of cold water that resist this internal movement. Furthermore, hydrogen bonding structures in hot water are temporarily disrupted, reducing the viscosity and allowing water molecules greater freedom of movement, which can facilitate more efficient cooling through radiation and convection mechanisms that cold water cannot achieve as effectively due to its more rigid molecular arrangement. The crystalline structure that forms as ice develops also exhibits different properties depending on the initial temperature of the source water, with hot water sometimes producing ice with fewer impurities and different lattice configurations that may propagate the freezing front more efficiently through the remaining liquid. Despite decades of scientific investigation and numerous proposed explanations, the Mpemba effect remains somewhat controversial and incompletely understood, with different experimental conditions producing varying results that have led some researchers to question whether the effect is as universal as once believed. Yet the phenomenon persists in careful laboratory settings under controlled conditions, demonstrating that our fundamental understanding of how temperature, phase transitions, and molecular behavior interact still contains gaps and mysteries that challenge even our most confident physical intuitions. Recent experiments using precise thermal imaging and molecular dynamics simulations have begun to reveal that the effect may be strongest in specific temperature ranges and container geometries, suggesting that what we once thought was a single universal phenomenon might actually represent multiple competing mechanisms that dominate under different circumstances, each contributing its own small advantage that collectively tips the scales in favor of the hotter sample's crystallization. This complexity underscores a fundamental lesson in physics, that phenomena we observe in nature often resist simple explanations, and that careful empirical observation, like Mpemba's patient experimentation, remains as vital to science as theoretical understanding, reminding us that wonder and mystery persist even in the most everyday substances and processes we encounter. Imagine you are tasked with measuring the coastline of Britain, a seemingly straightforward geographical problem that should have a definite answer. Yet when you actually attempt this measurement, you find yourself trapped in an endless spiral of increasing precision that never quite resolves into a final number. When you measure the coastline using a map with roads marked in large blocks, you might arrive at a figure like 5,000 kilometers. But when you zoom in with a more detailed map, the coastline suddenly becomes longer because you can now trace around smaller peninsulas and inlets that were invisible at the previous scale. Zoom in further with satellite imagery and the number grows again, and if you were to stand on the actual shore with a measuring tape, accounting for every rock, pebble, and grain of sand, the coastline would stretch on seemingly without end, approaching infinity as your unit of measurement approaches zero. This is not a failure of measurement or a reflection of inaccuracy, but rather a fundamental property of coastlines themselves, which possess what mathematicians call fractal geometry, meaning they exhibit self-similar complexity at every level of magnification, revealing new jagged details no matter how closely you examine them. The psychological mechanism underlying our acceptance of this paradox lies in our intuitive assumption that all natural features have a definite, objective size that exists independently of how we measure them, an assumption rooted in our everyday experience with smoothly curved objects where this assumption generally holds true. Yet coastlines, mountains, and clouds fundamentally violate this expectation because they are products of chaotic natural processes operating across multiple scales simultaneously, with waves and erosion creating patterns that repeat in miniature versions of themselves at smaller scales, generating infinite complexity that defies singular quantification. The mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot called this phenomenon the fractal nature of nature, demonstrating that the coastline paradox is not a quirk of measurement, but rather a revelation of something profound about how the natural world is actually structured at its most fundamental levels. We have normalized this paradox by simply accepting conventional definitions of coastline length based on whatever measurement scale we have chosen, understanding that the number we arrive at depends entirely on our resolution rather than on any objective property of the coast itself, allowing us to function despite the underlying infinity that remains quietly, perpetually present beneath every answer we give. Yet this acceptance comes with a subtle cost. We have learned to ignore the infinity lurking within our measurements, treating it as merely a technical artifact rather than confronting what it reveals about the limits of human knowledge itself. That some aspects of nature resist the quantification and certainty we instinctively seek, and perhaps always will. When we encounter this same pattern elsewhere, in the branching of blood vessels, the ramification of rivers, the jagged edge of a torn piece of paper, we begin to suspect that infinity is not confined to coastlines, but rather woven throughout the fabric of existence, a hidden constant that our minds have evolved to gloss over so that we might navigate a world too complex to fully comprehend, and in doing so we trade perfect knowledge for practical survival. Yet perhaps this is not a failure but a gift. In learning to accept measurement's inherent incompleteness, we develop a humility about our ability to reduce the world to numbers, and we begin to see that the most important truths about reality, its texture, its depth, its inexhaustible complexity, are precisely those that resist final quantification, remaining forever just beyond the reach of our instruments and our formulas. Imagine a government tasked with dividing seats in a legislative body among different states or regions based on population. A seemingly straightforward mathematical exercise that should produce consistent and predictable results every single time the calculation is performed. Yet in the late 19th century, the United States discovered something deeply unsettling about the process of apportionment, a paradox so counterintuitive that it challenged the very foundations of how we think about fair distribution and mathematical logic itself. When Congress needed to decide how many representatives each state would receive in the House of Representatives based on the 1880 census, mathematicians and politicians began testing different apportionment methods to ensure absolute fairness and proportional representation. One method, known as the Hamilton method or method of largest remainders, was particularly popular because it seemed to embody principles of democratic equity and mathematical precision. However, when Alabama's population increased along with the nation's overall growth, something bizarre occurred. Alabama actually lost a representative seat, despite the fact that both the total number of seats in Congress had increased and Alabama's population had grown. This phenomenon became known as the Alabama paradox, revealing that certain apportionment methods could produce this absurd outcome where increasing the total number of available seats could actually cause a state to receive fewer seats than before. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox emerges from the interaction between fractional remainders and rounding procedures inherent in apportionment mathematics, where the addition of extra seats to distribute can fundamentally alter which states benefit from the rounding up of their decimal populations, causing unexpected shifts in final seat allocations. The paradox persists in our collective consciousness, not because anyone has failed to understand it, but because we have largely normalized the existence of multiple equally valid, yet mutually contradictory mathematical methods for solving what appears to be a simple division problem, accepting that fairness itself might be fundamentally ambiguous rather than acknowledging that perhaps no perfect solution truly exists. This realization has forced democratic societies to make an uncomfortable choice: accept that mathematical perfection in apportionment is impossible, or establish arbitrary rules about which imperfect method to adopt, transforming what seemed like a technical problem into a fundamentally political one where the choice of algorithm itself determines winners and losers. The United States ultimately abandoned the Hamilton method in favor of the Webster method in 1911, yet this solution merely traded one set of paradoxes for another, demonstrating that the search for a mathematically perfect apportionment method was as futile as the search for a perpetual motion machine. A humbling reminder that some problems have no clean answers, only better or worse compromises. The deeper lesson extends beyond Congress itself. Whenever we design systems to allocate finite resources among competing groups, hospital beds during a pandemic, disaster relief funds across counties, or even school funding formulas, we inevitably embed philosophical choices about fairness into mathematical procedures, and these choices will always privilege some stakeholders over others in ways that pure mathematics alone can never resolve. Understanding this fundamental limitation becomes particularly urgent in our contemporary moment, where algorithmic decision-making increasingly governs resource distribution across healthcare systems, criminal justice, and artificial intelligence itself. Yet we rarely interrogate whether the mathematical frameworks we've inherited actually embody the values we claim to prioritize, or whether we've simply become comfortable with inequities we've learned to call inevitable. Consider the foundational tension that exists within liberal democratic societies, a tension so embedded in our institutions and philosophical frameworks that we rarely pause to examine it with genuine skepticism. The paradox emerges when we recognize that liberal systems, built upon the principle of maximum individual freedom and tolerance, must simultaneously restrict the freedoms of those who would actively seek to dismantle liberal democracy itself. This creates a logical knot that has troubled political philosophers for generations, and it manifests in concrete ways throughout modern governance, from laws against hate speech in ostensibly free societies to restrictions on political parties deemed anti-democratic, from content moderation policies that limit speech in the name of protecting speech, to immigration restrictions justified by the need to preserve liberal values. The paradox deepens when we observe that truly consistent liberalism, if taken to its absolute extreme, would theoretically permit the rise of authoritarianism through democratic means, would allow intolerant voices to eventually overwhelm tolerant ones, and would sanction the very mechanisms of oppression that liberalism was designed to prevent. The psychological mechanism underlying our acceptance of this paradox operates through what we might call defensive pragmatism, a quiet recognition that perfect ideological consistency is perhaps less important than survival, that abstract principles must bend slightly when confronted with the genuine threat of their own extinction. We have normalized this contradiction by developing sophisticated justifications. The concept of negative rights that restrict certain actions to protect broader freedoms, the notion of proportional response, where illiberal speech may be met with illiberal restrictions, the argument that tolerance itself becomes a limiting principle when extended to the intolerant. Yet the unresolved tension remains at the heart of liberal politics, creating ongoing debates about where exactly the boundaries should be drawn, who decides them, and whether those decisions themselves remain consistent with liberal values. The paradox persists not because we have solved it, but because we have collectively agreed to live with it as the price of maintaining functional democratic societies. And perhaps this acceptance itself reveals something deeper, that liberalism is not a fixed ideology to be perfected, but rather a perpetual negotiation between competing goods, freedom and security, individual rights and collective survival, where the conversation about where to draw boundaries matters more than any final answer ever could. This is perhaps why liberal societies seem perpetually anxious, forever litigating the boundaries of acceptable speech and acceptable restriction, and why each generation must re-argue these questions anew rather than inherit settled answers. The paradox cannot be resolved, only continuously renegotiated as circumstances shift and new threats emerge. What makes this renegotiation particularly complex in our current moment is that the threats have multiplied and fragmented. We no longer face a single, clearly identifiable authoritarian movement, but rather distributed networks of disinformation, algorithmic radicalization, and ideological movements that deliberately exploit liberal tolerance as a tactical advantage. Forcing liberal societies to develop increasingly intricate and arguably illiberal tools of surveillance and content control that themselves become potential vectors for the very oppression they claim to prevent. The irony cuts deepest when we recognize that the surveillance infrastructure built to protect liberal democracy from its enemies becomes itself a tool that could enable the very authoritarianism we fear, and that each defensive measure we implement potentially weakens the open society we're attempting to preserve, creating a recursive spiral where the cure and the disease become increasingly indistinguishable. Imagine that you're standing in a voting booth on election day, and you are about to cast a ballot that will almost certainly have no measurable impact on the outcome of the election you are participating in. The mathematical reality of modern democracy is that your individual vote, in a jurisdiction with thousands or millions of other voters, carries such an infinitesimally small probability of being the deciding factor that any rational calculation of cost versus benefit would suggest that the time and effort required to vote could be more productively spent on nearly any other activity whatsoever. This is the paradox that economist Anthony Downs identified and articulated in his groundbreaking work on voting behavior, and yet millions of people continue to participate in elections despite the apparent irrationality of doing so from a purely logical standpoint. The mechanism that Downs described operates on the principle that if we were to apply strict rational choice theory to the act of voting, where we multiply the probability that our vote will determine the outcome by the value of our preferred outcome, we would arrive at an expected utility that is essentially zero or perhaps even negative when we factor in the costs of researching candidates, traveling to polling places, and spending time away from work or leisure activities. And yet people do vote, not because they have suddenly discovered a flaw in Downs' mathematical formulation, but because voting has become embedded in our cultural, civic, and even personal identities in ways that transcend pure rational calculation. The paradox persists because humans are not purely rational actors who mechanically optimize every decision according to formal mathematical models, but rather creatures who derive meaning and satisfaction from participation in collective institutions, who feel a sense of civic duty that cannot be easily quantified in terms of expected utility, and who may vote not because they believe their single ballot will change the election outcome, but because the act of voting itself holds expressive value and connects them to something larger than themselves. We have normalized this apparent irrationality to such a degree that we rarely acknowledge it at all, instead treating voting as a self-evidently worthwhile activity that falls outside the domain of rational scrutiny, even though the underlying logic of individual decision-making would seem to suggest otherwise. This paradox reveals something fundamental about human behavior that pure economic models often fail to capture: that we participate in social institutions not always because we have calculated their direct personal benefits, but because doing so affirms our identity, reinforces our values, and connects us to the communities and systems that structure our lives. In this sense, the irrationality of voting may itself be rational in a deeper sense, one that accounts for the non-material rewards of civic participation, the reinforcement of democratic norms that sustain the system itself, and the long-term collective benefits that accrue when citizens treat voting as a duty rather than a mere cost-benefit calculation. The paradox dissolves not because Downs was wrong about the mathematics, but because he was working with an incomplete model of human motivation. When we recognize that humans derive utility from fulfilling social roles and maintaining self-image as conscientious citizens, the voter participation paradox transforms from a logical puzzle into a window into how societies persist through the internalization of collective commitments that no individual calculation alone could generate. In this way, democracy itself depends less on the triumph of rationality than on the persistence of what appears irrational, a willingness to bear costs for the sake of maintaining institutions that benefit everyone only if everyone participates, creating a virtuous circle where the apparent paradox of voting becomes the very mechanism through which democratic systems sustain themselves across generations. Imagine you are examining a data set of numbers, perhaps the populations of cities around the world, or the revenues of thousands of companies, or the lengths of rivers across continents, and you begin to notice something peculiar that at first seems impossible to explain. When you look at the first digit of these numbers, the digit that appears in the leftmost position, you discover that the number 1 appears far more frequently than any other digit, accounting for roughly 30% of all first digits in the dataset, while the number 9 appears in only about 5% of cases. This pattern persists across wildly different types of data, from financial records to astronomical measurements to the populations of towns, and it defies our intuitive sense of how randomness should distribute itself. Most people would naturally assume that each digit from 1 through 9 should appear with roughly equal probability, that in a truly random dataset all digits should hover around 11% frequency. Yet Benford's law, as this phenomenon is called, insists otherwise and continues to reveal itself in the real world with remarkable consistency. The mechanism underlying this strange pattern relates to how exponential growth functions in nature and in human society, where quantities tend to grow multiplicatively rather than additively, meaning that populations, financial values, and physical measurements often double or triple rather than increase by fixed amounts. When growth occurs exponentially, the numbers inevitably spend more time with smaller leading digits, because moving from 1 million to 2 million is a 100% increase, whereas moving from 9 million to 10 million is only an 11% increase, so there is far more numerical territory to cover in the ranges beginning with smaller digits. This mathematical reality, rooted in logarithmic distributions and the fundamental way that multiplication scales through orders of magnitude, explains why the digit 1 appears so often as a starting point in real-world datasets. Yet despite our modern understanding of this law, and despite its proven presence across countless datasets, we remain perpetually surprised when it appears, and many people continue to assume that data should be evenly distributed across first digits, as though our intuition about randomness has not yet fully incorporated this counterintuitive truth into our everyday thinking about how numbers in the world actually behave. Perhaps this blindness to Benford's law explains why forensic accountants have learned to use it as a tool for detecting fraud, since fabricated financial records tend to distribute first digits more evenly than nature allows, betraying the hand of human invention through their very attempt at randomness. When auditors examine tax returns or corporate ledgers and find that the first digits conform too perfectly to uniform distribution, they recognize the telltale signature of someone trying to appear random by being too evenly random, a paradox that has caught countless fraudsters who understood neither mathematics nor the stubborn way that reality insists on following logarithmic patterns rather than the democratic distribution that the human mind instinctively expects. The irony is profound. The very mathematical principle that governs so much of the natural world becomes, in the hands of those who ignore it, a confession of their own departure from that world, a fingerprint left at the scene of numerical crime that reveals not what was fabricated, but rather what the fabricator failed to understand about how reality actually counts. In this way, Benford's law serves as a reminder that the universe operates according to principles far subtler than our conscious minds readily grasp, and that truth, whether in nature or in data, has a signature that cannot be successfully counterfeited without first understanding the deep mathematics from which it emerges. The Will Rogers moving average represents a peculiar statistical phenomenon that occurs whenever you remove the lowest performing elements from a dataset, and through that removal alone, you inadvertently increase the average value of the remaining elements, even though nothing about those remaining elements has actually improved in any meaningful way. The paradox takes its name from the American humorist Will Rogers, who once joked that when the Okies left Oklahoma during the Great Depression and moved to California, they raised the average intelligence of both states, a darkly comedic observation about how removing a subset of a population can mathematically elevate the remaining group's statistics without any actual change in the characteristics being measured. Imagine a school district that decides to exclude all students scoring below a certain threshold from their standardized test average in order to improve their reported performance metrics. Or consider a company that removes its lowest performing branch from its quarterly earnings calculations, thereby appearing more profitable without having actually increased revenue or efficiency anywhere within the organization itself. The mechanism at work here involves a fundamental confusion between measurement and reality, where we treat statistical artifacts as if they represent genuine improvement when they merely represent selective inclusion or exclusion of data points. This paradox persists because it exploits the gap between what numbers appear to show us and what those numbers actually represent, allowing institutions and individuals to claim success through definitional manipulation rather than substantive change. We have normalized this phenomenon throughout modern society, particularly in corporate environments where right-sizing, strategic downsizing, and portfolio optimization become euphemisms for removing lower-performing elements specifically to improve reported averages and metrics that investors and stakeholders scrutinize. Healthcare systems might exclude their sickest patients from certain outcome calculations, Educational institutions might count only their highest-achieving graduates when reporting success rates, and investment portfolios might eliminate their worst performers to showcase improved returns, all while the underlying quality or performance of what remains has not genuinely advanced. The Will Rogers moving average demonstrates how easily we can confuse the mathematics of exclusion with the reality of improvement, and how readily we accept this confusion when it produces flattering statistics about ourselves, our institutions, or our investments. The insidious nature of this phenomenon lies in its invisibility. We rarely notice when we've shifted from measuring genuine progress to merely rearranging the composition of what we're measuring. And by the time we do notice, the improved metrics have already been celebrated, rewarded, and baked into policy decisions that affect real people and real outcomes. What makes the Will Rogers moving average particularly dangerous is that it offers a kind of moral cover for decline, allowing us to report upward trends while actual conditions deteriorate for those removed from our calculations. When a hospital discharges its most expensive patients to improve its cost per admission metrics, or when a university stops admitting students with learning disabilities to boost its graduation rate statistics, we witness this mechanism in its purest form. The systematic exclusion of difficulty repackaged as institutional success, a sleight of hand that transforms abandonment into achievement and leaves the excluded worse off than before, while their removal paradoxically validates the system that failed them. The tragedy of the Will Rogers moving average is that it operates most effectively precisely when we need honest measurement most urgently, in systems serving vulnerable populations where exclusion compounds existing disadvantages, creating a feedback loop where the most troubled cases disappear from our metrics just as they become most desperate for help. Imagine you are a physician working at a major hospital and you notice something peculiar in your data. Among patients admitted to your facility, smoking and lung disease appear to be negatively correlated, meaning that smokers seem less likely to have lung disease than non-smokers, which defies everything we know about the relationship between tobacco and respiratory health. This counterintuitive observation troubled statistician Joseph Berkson in the 1940s, and when he investigated further, he discovered something that would fundamentally alter how we understand conditional probability and the nature of observational bias in medicine. The phenomenon he identified, now called Berkson's paradox, reveals that when you condition your observation on a specific event, in this case hospital admission, you can create spurious negative correlations between variables that are actually independent or even positively correlated in the general population. The mechanism works like this. People enter hospitals for many reasons, and if we only examine patients who are already hospitalized, we are looking at a filtered subset of the entire population. Among hospitalized patients, someone might be admitted because they smoke, or because they have lung disease, or because of some entirely different condition like a broken leg or appendicitis. However, if a person is admitted to the hospital and they don't smoke, then the hospital admission must be explained by something else, which increases the relative likelihood that they were admitted for a serious illness like lung disease. Conversely, if a hospitalized patient is a heavy smoker, the admission might be fully explained by smoking-related complications, which paradoxically reduces the conditional probability that they are also suffering from other serious lung conditions at that specific moment. This creates an apparent negative relationship between smoking and lung disease within the hospital population, even though in the real world these factors are positively correlated. What makes Berkson's paradox so insidious is that it operates silently within any filtered or selected subset of data, lurking beneath statistical analyses that appear rigorous and well-founded. Doctors and researchers might spend years trying to understand why their hospital data contradicts established medical knowledge, never realizing that the contradiction is entirely an artifact of their sampling method. The bias persists because we intuitively trust data that comes from our own institutions and our own observations, and we tend to assume that if we have carefully collected information from a reliable source like a hospital, that information accurately reflects reality. We rarely question whether the very act of selecting certain cases has fundamentally altered the relationships between variables. Furthermore, confirmation bias ensures that once we observe this pattern, we might unconsciously seek explanations that support it, rather than questioning whether the pattern itself is real. Berkson's paradox has practical consequences that extend far beyond theoretical statistics, affecting medical research, epidemiology, and clinical decision-making in ways that are still being discovered today. For instance, a researcher studying the relationship between coffee consumption and heart disease might find a surprising protective effect of coffee in hospital populations, simply because healthy coffee drinkers rarely need hospitalization, while those with heart disease are overrepresented in the sample regardless of their caffeine habits. Recognizing Berkson's paradox requires us to remain vigilant about the invisible boundaries of our data and to always ask, what populations are we excluding, and how might that exclusion be reshaping the correlations we observe? Understanding this bias has become essential in the age of big data, where researchers increasingly work with pre-filtered datasets, electronic health records, insurance claims, online surveys, each carrying its own hidden selection mechanisms that silently distort the true relationships we seek to understand. Imagine two economists examining the exact same dataset, the same numbers, the same raw information about inflation rates or unemployment figures or market performance, yet they arrive at completely opposite conclusions about what the data actually means and what policy recommendations should follow from it. This is Lord's statistical disagreement, a phenomenon named after economist Powell Anderson Lord, who discovered that when people of different statistical philosophies examine identical evidence, they systematically reach incompatible interpretations, not because one has made a mathematical error or because the data is ambiguous in any ordinary sense, but because they are quite literally asking different questions and applying different frameworks of what counts as valid reasoning in the first place. The disagreement arises most sharply when comparing classical frequentist statisticians, who believe that probabilities describe the long-run frequency of events in repeated sampling, with Bayesian statisticians, who treat probabilities as expressions of subjective belief that should be updated in light of new information. When a classical statistician looks at a dataset, they are asking whether they would observe such extreme results if a particular null hypothesis were true, constructing confidence intervals based on the behavior of statistics across hypothetical infinite repetitions that will never actually occur. When a Bayesian statistician examines those same numbers, they are asking what their posterior probability distribution over possible parameter values should be, incorporating both what they believed before seeing the data and what the likelihood of observing these particular numbers would be under different scenarios. The paradox deepens because neither approach is technically wrong in a mathematical sense. Both are internally coherent systems of reasoning that follow their own logical rules perfectly. It is the foundational assumptions about what probability means and what the goal of statistical analysis should be that diverge so fundamentally that even perfect agreement on the raw numbers produces a permanent disagreement about interpretation. This persists in practice because the choice between these frameworks cannot itself be resolved through statistical evidence, since any statistical argument for preferring one framework would necessarily presuppose that very framework to establish its superiority. The field of statistics has essentially normalized this disagreement by treating it as a methodological choice rather than an error or confusion. Yet practitioners often behave as though their chosen framework is objectively correct, creating a peculiar situation where educated experts can spend their entire careers using perfectly rigorous methods, while remaining in perpetual disagreement with colleagues using equally rigorous methods that simply start from different premises about the nature of knowledge itself. A practical consequence is that a drug approval agency and a pharmaceutical company might both be entirely honest and rigorous in their statistical analyses of the same clinical trial data. Yet one concludes the treatment is safe enough to recommend, while the other concludes it remains too risky, not because they miscalculated, but because they weighted prior skepticism differently or chose different loss functions for different types of potential errors, revealing how statistical disagreement can have profound real-world implications despite mathematical consensus on the numbers themselves. This explains why statistical disagreements often feel intractable even among people of goodwill. They are disagreements about epistemology disguised as disagreements about data, making them resistant to resolution through the very methods both parties hold most dear, and suggesting that some fundamental disagreements in science, policy, and medicine may be less about discovering facts and more about choosing which framework for reasoning about uncertainty we are willing to accept as legitimate. Consider the paradoxical experience of attempting to suppress a thought or emotion, only to find that the very act of suppression makes that thought or emotion return with greater intensity and frequency than it would have had you simply allowed it to exist in the first place. Imagine a person lying in bed at night who becomes anxious about falling asleep, and in response to this anxiety, they tell themselves firmly that they must not think about their worries, must not allow their mind to wander toward the stressful events of tomorrow, must maintain only calm and peaceful thoughts. Within moments, paradoxically, the thought of sleep itself becomes unbearably prominent in their consciousness, and the anxiety they were attempting to suppress metastasizes into an even more acute form of restlessness. The harder they push the anxious thoughts away, the more forcefully those thoughts return, like a beach ball held underwater that springs violently back to the surface the moment you release your grip. This phenomenon extends far beyond sleep anxiety into the realm of intrusive thoughts, emotional regulation, and even behavioral impulses. A person struggling with unwanted aggressive thoughts may find that their deliberate attempts to not think about harming themselves or others paradoxically increases the frequency and vividness of these very thoughts. Someone trying to suppress their desire to check social media compulsively finds that the urge becomes almost irresistible the moment they commit to not looking at their phone. The psychological mechanism operating beneath this paradox emerges from the nature of cognitive control itself. When we attempt to suppress a thought, we must first activate a representation of that thought in our mind in order to know what we are attempting to suppress. This initial activation plants the seed of the thought more firmly into our working memory, making it more accessible and more likely to surface spontaneously. Furthermore, the act of suppressing requires continuous attentional resources and cognitive effort, and the moment our attention wavers or our willpower becomes depleted, the suppressed thought floods back with even greater salience because it has been effectively rehearsed and reinforced through repeated suppression attempts. Additionally, there exists a phenomenon known as the ironic rebound effect, wherein the more someone is explicitly instructed not to think about something, the more that something dominates their thoughts. This creates a cruel feedback loop, where the very strategy we employ to manage intrusive thoughts becomes the mechanism by which those thoughts proliferate and intensify. What makes this paradox so deeply unusual is that we continue to employ suppression as a primary emotional and cognitive regulation strategy, despite overwhelming evidence that it often backfires and worsens the very conditions we seek to alleviate. We remain trapped in a normalized state of contradiction, where our intuitive responses to unwanted mental content are precisely the responses most likely to strengthen that content. We tell ourselves and others to just not think about something, to push feelings away, to ignore distracting thoughts, despite the fact that these instructions are fundamentally counterproductive. The suppression effect regression persists as a foundational paradox of human consciousness, a testament to the gap between our intuitive understanding of mental control and the actual mechanisms by which our minds operate. Yet perhaps the deepest irony lies in recognizing that acceptance, the deliberate choice to allow unwanted thoughts and emotions to exist without resistance, often proves far more effective at diminishing their intensity than any amount of suppressive effort ever could, suggesting that our path to mental freedom runs not through control, but through surrender. Imagine you are a food safety inspector tasked with visiting restaurants across your city to ensure they meet health codes, and you have limited time and resources to conduct these inspections. Rather than visiting every establishment equally, you naturally tend to focus your attention on restaurants that have previously failed inspections, that operate in neighborhoods with older buildings, or that serve cuisines you perceive as higher risk, perhaps because you have vague memories of foodborne illness outbreaks associated with certain types of cuisine in the past. Over time, your inspection data begins to show a clear pattern. These restaurants fail inspections at much higher rates than others, and you feel validated in your selective approach because the numbers seem to confirm your initial suspicions. However, what you are actually observing is not evidence that your targeting strategy is sound, but rather a self-fulfilling prophecy where your deliberate choice of which establishments to inspect has created the very pattern you were trying to identify. This is inspection selection bias, a paradox where the act of choosing what to inspect based on pre-existing assumptions fundamentally corrupts the data you collect, making it impossible to distinguish between genuine patterns and artifacts of your selection methodology. The mechanism operates on a deceptively simple principle. When you selectively inspect entities that match certain criteria, you will necessarily find more violations among those entities, not necessarily because they are inherently more problematic, but because you are giving them more scrutiny. A restaurant you inspect 5 times a year will accumulate more documented violations than a restaurant you inspect once a year, even if both maintain identical standards. The data appears to speak for itself, yet it is entirely shaped by your choices about where to direct your attention. The paradox deepens when we recognize that this bias persists even when inspectors are fully aware of its existence and intellectually committed to avoiding it. A quality control manager in manufacturing might consciously decide to randomly sample products, yet still unconsciously allocate more inspection time to production lines that previously showed defects, thereby discovering more new defects in those lines and reinforcing the belief that they are genuinely lower quality. A bank auditor tasked with detecting fraud might focus on accounts that fit a certain profile, then conclude that those profiles are reliable predictors of fraud, when in fact they are simply identifying where fraud is being looked for rather than where it actually occurs most frequently. A teacher reviewing student work might allocate more critical attention to assignments from students they perceive as lower performing, discovering more errors in those papers and reinforcing their assessment, while overlooking identical errors in work from students they perceive as stronger. What makes this paradox so persistent is that it operates invisibly within systems designed to be objective and neutral. Statistical records seem to validate the approach, since they directly result from it. The bias is not a matter of conscious prejudice or deliberate unfairness, but rather an inevitable consequence of finite resources meeting infinite possible inspection targets. We cannot inspect everything equally, so we must choose what to prioritize. Yet the moment we make that choice based on any criteria whatsoever, we contaminate our ability to assess whether those criteria were valid in the first place. The result is a closed epistemic loop. We use our suspicions to guide inspections, the inspections generate data that confirms our suspicions, and we then cite that data as justification for maintaining the same inspection strategy, never realizing that we have merely documented our own choices rather than discovered objective truth. Imagine a trader who begins with $100 and through careful strategy and market timing manages to double this sum to $200 in the first month. Encouraged by this success, the trader continues with the same methodology and doubles again, reaching $400 in the second month. The pattern continues seamlessly through month 3, 4, and 5, with the account swelling to $800, then $1,600, then $3,200. This exponential growth feels inevitable, almost supernatural in its consistency, and the trader becomes convinced that the doubling strategy represents a genuine path to unlimited wealth. However, there exists a hidden mechanism at work here, one that reveals itself not in the moment of success, but in the moment of failure. The Probsting paradox, named after financial researcher Harry Probsting, demonstrates that while doubling your account repeatedly is theoretically possible, the mathematical requirements become increasingly severe with each iteration. The problem emerges when we consider not the best-case scenario, but the realistic likelihood of market volatility. If a trader uses a fixed percentage of their account on each trade, designed to double the account if successful, then a single loss at any point will eliminate all previous gains and much more besides. The paradox intensifies when we realize that to maintain the doubling strategy indefinitely, the trader must achieve a winning percentage that becomes mathematically impossible in any real market. For a strategy that doubles on win and loses some percentage on loss, the long-term sustainability requires not a 50-50 win rate, but rather a win rate so extraordinarily high that no trader or system could realistically maintain it. Yet many traders, and indeed many investing philosophies that have achieved temporary success, fall victim to this illusion. They observe a period of doubling returns and extrapolate infinitely forward, constructing narratives of personal genius or superior methodology. The mechanism that enables this paradox to persist is our profound cognitive bias toward pattern recognition and our tendency to confuse correlation with causation. When we see 5 consecutive months of doubling, our minds naturally construct a coherent story explaining why this occurred, and we rarely pause to calculate the precise mathematical conditions required for this pattern to continue. The Probsting doubling ruin teaches us that financial ruin often arrives not as a sudden catastrophic loss, but as the inevitable conclusion of a mathematical law that was always operating silently in the background. The trader who doubled 5 times in a row is not wealthier than the trader who doubled 4 times and then lost everything, because both have been captured by the same invisible mathematical truth. We normalize this paradox by celebrating success stories while ignoring the countless failures that followed similar trajectories, creating a survivor bias so complete that the paradox itself becomes hidden behind narratives of skill and strategy. This is why the most dangerous moment in any trader's career often arrives not during their first loss, but during their first sustained period of success, when the mathematics of ruin becomes invisible precisely because it wears the mask of triumph. The Probsting doubling ruin reminds us that in finance, as in life, the greatest risks are those we cannot see because we are too busy celebrating what we can. This is precisely why the most prudent traders maintain strict position sizing rules and loss limits, understanding that the preservation of capital across many small failures is infinitely more valuable than the pursuit of exponential gains that collapse under the weight of a single inevitable drawdown. The paradox ultimately reveals that wealth accumulation is not a sprint toward doubling, but a marathon of consistent, modest returns combined with the discipline to survive long enough for compound growth to work its quiet magic. Imagine an infinite number of monkeys sitting at typewriters, each one striking keys completely at random, without any understanding of what they are doing, without any intention or purpose guiding their movements, just pressing keys endlessly through the infinite expanse of time itself. According to the mathematical principle proposed by French mathematician Émile Borel in the early 20th century, if these monkeys were to type forever, they would eventually produce every possible text that has ever been written or could ever be written, including the complete works of Shakespeare, every scientific paper ever published, every love letter ever composed, and indeed every combination of letters that could theoretically exist. The paradox lies not in the mathematical truth of the statement, which is actually logically sound, but rather in the profound absurdity of what it suggests about probability, infinity, and the nature of meaning itself. When you truly sit with this concept, your mind begins to bend under the weight of its implications, because while the mathematics says it must be true, our intuition screams that it is impossible, that randomness could never accidentally produce the intricate architecture of human knowledge and creativity. The mechanism at work here is the relationship between infinite time and infinite possibilities, combined with how our brains fundamentally misunderstand what infinity actually means. We think of infinity as just a very large number, as something bigger than we can count to, but infinity is not a quantity at all. It is a concept that utterly transcends our ordinary experience, and when you combine true infinity with probability, even impossibly unlikely events become not just possible, but certain to occur eventually. The real strangeness emerges when we recognize that we do not actually need infinite monkeys or infinite time in an absolute sense. We only need enough of each to make the probability cascade downward until something resembles order emerges from chaos, and yet our minds resist this conclusion because it seems to strip away the specialness of creation, the remarkable nature of how improbable our existence truly is. We have largely normalized this paradox by accepting it as a mathematical curiosity, a clever thought experiment that proves something clever about infinity while remaining safely abstract and divorced from reality. Yet it persists in our collective consciousness precisely because it hints at something deeply troubling about randomness, meaning, and whether the universe itself could be nothing more than an infinite library of accidents, where everything that can exist does exist. Somewhere in the infinite branches of possibility, waiting to be discovered rather than created. This realization transforms how we might understand our own existence. If infinite possibility space contains all possible arrangements of matter and meaning, then perhaps consciousness itself is not a miracle of creation, but an inevitability of infinity, something that was always bound to emerge somewhere in the vast library of what could be, making us simultaneously both utterly insignificant and absolutely certain to exist. Yet this perspective also invites a haunting question. If everything that can be written already exists in infinite possibility space, waiting only to be typed, then what separates a genuine discovery from merely uncovering something that was always destined to be found, and does that distinction even matter when the end result is identical? Perhaps this is why the image of those infinite monkeys has haunted us for over a century, not because it reveals the mathematical nature of infinity, but because it forces us to confront whether our most cherished creations, our scientific breakthroughs, and even our sense of individual purpose, our genuine achievements, or merely the inevitable consequences of probability playing out across an infinite stage. Leaving us to wonder if genius itself is nothing more than the act of being the first to recognize what was always going to be typed anyway. Imagine standing in a vast library where the shelves stretch infinitely in every direction, and you're told by a librarian that while you can count every single book in this library one by one, assigning each a number in sequence, the library itself is somehow uncountably infinite in a way that transcends your ability to enumerate it. And this contradiction sits at the heart of one of mathematics' most disorienting paradoxes, known as Skollem's countable uncountable. The paradox emerges from a peculiar interaction between two fundamental mathematical concepts: the formal axioms that mathematicians use to construct their theories, and the actual objects those theories appear to describe. For when we build a mathematical universe using the standard Zermelo-Finkel axioms with the axiom of choice, we can prove that certain infinite sets are uncountable, meaning no function can list all their elements in a sequence. Yet within the same logical framework, there exists a model where those supposedly uncountable sets are actually countable, where each element can theoretically be enumerated, which creates a vertiginous loop in which what is proven uncountable in one context becomes demonstrably countable in another context that obeys the same rules. The mechanism behind this paradox rests on a subtle but profound distinction between absolute infinity and relative infinity, between what is true in one model of mathematics and what is true in another. For just as the concept of distance depends on which frame of reference you occupy, the concept of countability depends on which mathematical universe you inhabit. And the axioms of mathematics do not pin down a single unique universe, but rather permit multiple universes to exist in which the same set can be countable in one universe and uncountable in another. What makes Skollem's paradox psychologically unnerving is that it reveals the fundamental inscrutability of infinity itself. For we tend to imagine that when we prove something is uncountable, we have discovered something absolutely true about the universe. Yet mathematics quietly shows us that uncountability is not an absolute property, but a relative one, dependent on what logical tools and what perspective you bring to bear. We have normalized this paradox by developing a sophisticated understanding of model theory, by accepting that different models of set theory can coexist without contradiction, by learning to distinguish between what is true in a particular mathematical universe versus what is true absolutely. Yet this normalization often masks the deeper vertigo beneath. The realization that our most confident mathematical statements about infinity are contingent on our choice of axioms and our choice of model, that the infinite is less a realm of objective fact and more a landscape of consistent fictions, each logically sound but none uniquely privileged by reality itself. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson Skollem's paradox teaches us, that infinity is not discovered but negotiated, not found in nature but constructed through the very language we use to speak about it, so that when we encounter what seems like a contradiction between countability and uncountability, we are really encountering the freedom and the vertigo of mathematical creation itself. In this light, Skollem's paradox becomes not a flaw in mathematics but a feature, a reminder that the infinite transcends any single descriptive framework, and that our theories are powerful tools for exploring consistent logical worlds rather than mirrors held up to some pre-existing mathematical reality waiting passively to be discovered. The same insight applies to other mathematical paradoxes, from the liar's sentence to Cantor's diagonal argument, each revealing not a flaw in reasoning but a boundary where language begins to fold back on itself, where the act of description necessarily transforms what is being described, reminding us that mathematics at its deepest levels is not about truth in some Platonic heaven, but about the intricate dance between symbol and meaning, between what we can say and what we can construct. Consider the peculiar linguistic territory we occupy when we begin to examine words themselves as objects worthy of the very properties they describe. And imagine a mathematician named Kurt Grelling, who, in 1923, posed a question so deceptively simple that it has continued to unsettle logicians and philosophers for an entire century since its initial formulation. The paradox emerges from a fundamental distinction between two categories of words, a distinction that seems entirely reasonable upon first encounter, but which dissolves into contradiction the moment we attempt to apply it with absolute precision. A word is called autological, Grelling proposed, when the word itself possesses the property that it describes, and the classic example is the word polysyllabic, which is itself polysyllabic, containing multiple syllables as it names the quality of containing multiple syllables, a perfect alignment between the label and the labeled. Conversely, a word is called heterological when it does not possess the property it describes, such as the word monosyllabic, which is distinctly not monosyllabic, but rather contains 4 syllables, thus failing to exemplify the very characteristic it is meant to designate. This categorical division seems clean and logical, a straightforward way to organize words based on their relationship to their own definitions. Yet the moment we ask whether the word heterological itself is heterological or autological, we find ourselves trapped in a logical spiral from which there is no escape. If heterological is heterological, meaning it possesses the quality of being a heterological word, then by definition it must not possess the property it describes, which would make it autological, a direct contradiction. Yet if heterological is autological, meaning it possesses the property of being a heterological word, then it must not possess any property it describes, which means it cannot be heterological, and we arrive again at the opposite conclusion and thus back at the original impossibility. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through the phenomenon of self-reference, that strange and slippery property by which language can fold back upon itself and create statements that comment upon their own validity, much like a snake consuming its own tail or a camera pointed at a mirror that shows the camera itself. Our minds have become remarkably adept at handling self-referential statements in everyday discourse. We manage somehow to navigate sentences about sentences and words about words without constant epistemological crisis. And yet, when we formalize these operations and attempt to categorize them with logical rigor, the entire structure becomes unstable. The persistence of this paradox, despite its apparent meaninglessness, and its lack of practical application in the world beyond academic philosophy, reveals something fundamental about the nature of language itself and the categories we use to organize our understanding. We have normalized the notion that language can always be cleanly sorted into categories based on objective properties, that every word falls definitively into one camp or another, and yet this paradox demonstrates that some classifications, when applied to language itself, generate contradictions that no amount of logical analysis can resolve. The word heterological stands as a perpetual monument to the limitations of self-reference, a linguistic structure that cannot coherently exist within the categorical system it helps define, and in contemplating this impossibility, we glimpse the profound strangeness lurking within the very foundation of how we communicate and think. Yet perhaps this impossibility itself offers a peculiar kind of wisdom, that language, having evolved for practical communication rather than logical perfection, contains within its very structure the seeds of paradox, and that our attempts to formalize it completely may be doomed not by our insufficient cleverness, but by the fundamental nature of self-reference itself, which resists the kind of hierarchical ordering that logic demands. Consider the curious phenomenon known as Berry's shortest description, a paradox that emerges from the simple act of defining numbers through language, and which reveals something profound about the relationship between meaning, length, and self-reference in our attempts to categorize the world around us. The paradox begins innocently enough when we consider that any whole number can be described using English words, and that some numbers require lengthy descriptions while others can be described quite briefly, such as how the number 4 might be described as the smallest composite number, or 2 plus 2, whereas a much larger number might require a paragraph of complex mathematical exposition to distinguish it from all other numbers. Now this observation leads us naturally to consider what would happen if we attempted to find the smallest number that cannot be described in fewer than, say, 20 English words, because if such a number existed, we could describe it as precisely the smallest number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, and this description itself contains far fewer than 20 words, meaning we have just described in brief form a number that supposedly cannot be briefly described, creating an elegant logical contradiction that sits at the heart of this paradox. What makes Berry's shortest description particularly fascinating is that it does not rely on mathematical impossibility or physical laws, but instead operates entirely within the realm of language and meaning, forcing us to confront the slippery nature of what it means to describe something and whether descriptions can truly be objective, or whether they are always dependent on context, intention, and the specific linguistic community that shares them. The mechanism underlying this paradox reveals how our intuitive understanding of language fails when we try to apply formal logical operations to it, because we assume that descriptions have fixed lengths and fixed meanings, when in reality language is fluid and context-dependent, and what counts as a valid description shifts subtly depending on who is reading it and what background knowledge they possess. The paradox persists in our thinking despite its obvious logical problem, because we naturally treat language as if it were a formal system like mathematics, complete with rigid rules and precise boundaries, when in fact natural language thrives in ambiguity and permits multiple valid interpretations of nearly every statement. And this deep mismatch between how we intuitively model language and how language actually functions in the real world allows paradoxes like this one to continue puzzling us, generation after generation, even as we grow more sophisticated in our understanding of logic and mathematics, suggesting that perhaps no amount of formal analysis can fully capture the essential flexibility that makes language such a powerful tool for human communication. Perhaps this is why Berry's paradox has haunted philosophers and logicians for over a century. It serves as a humbling reminder that language, for all its precision when formalized, remains fundamentally different from the mathematical objects it attempts to describe, and that any attempt to reduce one to the other will inevitably encounter the kind of strange loops and self-referential tangles that make paradoxes possible in the first place. Yet perhaps this is also why Berry's paradox remains so valuable. It teaches us that the boundaries between language and logic are not merely blurred but fundamentally permeable, and that understanding this permeability may be essential if we ever hope to build artificial systems capable of truly comprehending human meaning rather than merely manipulating symbols according to predetermined rules. In this sense, Berry's paradox becomes not merely a logical curiosity, but a window into understanding the nature of meaning itself, suggesting that any formal system capable of describing the world must remain fundamentally incomplete if it attempts to describe itself within its own framework. In the Roman writer Petronius's satirical novel The Satyricon, there exists a curious passage that describes a ship which had been so frequently repaired and patched throughout its many voyages that eventually not a single plank of the original vessel remained. Yet the ship was still referred to by the same name and considered to be the same ship by all who sailed upon it. This paradox, which has come to be known as the ship of Theseus problem when applied more broadly to philosophical discourse, presents us with a profound question about identity and continuity that has troubled philosophers and thoughtful people for nearly 2,000 years. The scenario seems deceptively simple on its surface, yet it contains within it a fundamental puzzle about what makes something itself and not something else. When a ship's hull becomes damaged from the sea's relentless assault, wooden planks are replaced with new timber, one by one, until gradually the entire structure consists of fresh materials, yet everyone still calls it the same ship because it has maintained continuous operation and served the same purpose. This situation reflects a mechanism of human cognition that privileges function and continuity of purpose over material composition, a tendency that allows us to organize our understanding of the world into stable categories even when the underlying substance of those categories is constantly changing. We do this automatically and without conscious deliberation in nearly every aspect of our lives. A person replaces virtually every cell in their body over a span of approximately 7 to 10 years, yet we consider ourselves to be fundamentally the same individual throughout our entire existence, maintaining continuity of identity through memory and consciousness rather than through physical sameness. A nation's population transforms completely across generations. Its territory may shift, its government structures evolve or even revolve, yet the nation maintains a persistent identity through historical continuity and institutional memory. An organization like a university might exist for hundreds of years, completely replacing its faculty, students, and even its physical buildings, yet it remains recognizable as the same institution. What is remarkable about this persistence is that we have collectively agreed upon criteria for identity that have nothing to do with material composition or physical substance. And yet we rarely stop to question the arbitrary nature of these criteria or acknowledge that other equally valid frameworks for understanding identity might exist. The ship of Petronius continues to sail in the harbor of our minds, because we have normalized the idea that identity is something that transcends mere material reality, something that depends instead on narrative continuity, functional purpose, and the observer's willingness to treat the changing entity as fundamentally unchanged. This paradox persists not because we have failed to solve it, but because it accurately reflects the way consciousness itself organizes experience, and we have built our entire conceptual framework around this fundamental peculiarity of how minds work. Perhaps it is precisely this alignment between the paradox and the architecture of consciousness that explains why the ship of Theseus has endured as a philosophical problem for nearly 2 millennia, not as a puzzle demanding solution, but as a mirror reflecting back to us the irreducible complexity of how we assign meaning and continuity to the world, and in doing so, reveal something essential about the nature of thought itself. In this way, Petronius's ship becomes not merely a rhetorical device, but an epistemological tool, a way of acknowledging that our categories of identity are less discoveries about objective reality and more creative impositions we layer upon an ever-changing world to make it comprehensible to our finite minds. Imagine standing at the edge of a river in ancient times, watching a crocodile emerge from the water with a terrible proposition for you. The crocodile has seized your child and offers you a choice that seems to contain its own logical solution, yet creates an impenetrable knot of reasoning. The crocodile says this: "If you can correctly guess what I will do with your child, I will return them to you unharmed, but if you guess incorrectly, I will take them away forever." This scenario, attributed to the Stoic philosopher Chrysippus and refined through centuries of logical discourse, presents a paradox so elegant in its construction that it has troubled philosophers for over 2,000 years, and it does so because it forces us to confront the limitations of promise-keeping and prediction itself. The dilemma emerges most sharply when you attempt to guess that the crocodile will keep your child, because if you guess correctly, then according to the crocodile's own terms, it must return your child, which means it did not keep them, which means your guess was actually wrong, and therefore it should keep them, which means your guess was right, creating an endless loop of logical contradiction that neither the crocodile nor you can escape. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating from a psychological standpoint is that it operates on the principle of self-referential statements, where the act of making a prediction about the future necessarily changes the conditions that would make the prediction true or false, much like the famous observation that any accurate weather forecast will alter the very behavior that was being predicted. The crocodile dilemma relies on the assumption that all statements must be either true or false, and that any promise made must be kept according to specific logical rules, yet it demonstrates that certain combinations of conditions can create situations where these fundamental assumptions break down entirely. We continue to study and discuss this ancient thought experiment not because crocodiles actually make such bargains with us, but because it reveals something profound about the nature of language, logic, and commitment itself, showing us that our carefully constructed systems of reasoning can contain within them the seeds of their own paradoxical dissolution. And that sometimes the most rigorous application of logical thinking can lead us to situations where no logically consistent action remains possible. This recognition invites us to consider whether such paradoxes are merely logical curiosities, or whether they point to genuine limitations in how language can represent reality, a question that continues to animate debates in philosophy of language and artificial intelligence, where self-referential systems regularly encounter similar breakdowns in their ability to process contradictory instructions with perfect consistency. Yet perhaps the deepest insight the crocodile offers us is not that logic fails, but that reality itself may be more flexible than our binary systems allow, suggesting that some dilemmas cannot be resolved through reasoning alone, but only through acceptance of genuine indeterminacy, a humbling lesson that ancient philosophers understood but modern logic has often struggled to accommodate. Perhaps this is why the crocodile dilemma has endured not as a problem to be solved, but as a mirror held up to the limits of our own reasoning, reminding us that wisdom sometimes lies not in forcing a logical resolution, but in recognizing when we have reached the boundary where thought itself must yield to acceptance and humility. In this way, the crocodile becomes not merely an antagonist in a logical puzzle, but a teacher offering us permission to transcend the rigid categories that bind our thinking, showing us that the most profound truths often lie precisely at the points where our systematic reasoning reaches its breaking point, and must give way to a more spacious understanding of what is possible. Consider the peculiar phenomenon that emerges when we examine the British geneticist John Burdon Sanderson Haldane and his pattern of making bold predictions about the future of science and technology. Predictions that seemed absurd at the time yet accumulated a strange accuracy rate that defied reasonable expectation, creating a kind of reverse paradox, where the act of skepticism toward his specific claims somehow validated his broader vision of scientific possibility. Haldane, throughout the 1920s and beyond, made dozens of specific forecasts about human reproduction, organ transplantation, genetic engineering, and the nature of life itself. Predictions that were dismissed by his contemporaries as the fantasies of an imaginative mind rather than the reasoned extrapolations of a genuine scientist. Yet decades later, these predictions began manifesting in the actual world with uncanny precision. The paradox deepens when we recognize that Haldane was not making lucky guesses based on random speculation, but rather was employing his deep understanding of evolutionary biology and biochemistry to project forward what natural laws would permit. Yet the scientific establishment of his era treated these projections as though they were science fiction rather than rigorous logical inference. What makes this phenomenon particularly strange is not merely that Haldane was often correct, but that his being correct created a retroactive embarrassment for those who had dismissed him, an embarrassment that persists because it reveals something uncomfortable about how the scientific community filters innovation and possibility. The mechanism underlying this queerness involves the psychological phenomenon of present assumption bias, wherein we unconsciously assume that the current limits of technology and understanding represent something approaching fundamental limits, rather than merely contemporary limitations, and therefore when someone projects beyond these assumed limits, they appear to be transcending science rather than simply following it further. Haldane understood that life itself, being governed by chemistry and physics, had no reason to exclude any phenomenon that those disciplines permitted, yet this reasoning seemed almost heretical because it violated the implicit assumption that nature had largely revealed its secrets and that surprising things were unlikely. What persists today despite our awareness of this pattern is a subtle version of the same bias, wherein we continue to treat many current impossibilities as likely permanent rather than merely delayed, and we continue to experience surprise when scientific predictions made by careful thinkers prove more accurate than the skeptical dismissals of expert opinion, suggesting that the queerness of Haldane prediction remains woven into the fabric of how we collectively imagine and constrain the future. Perhaps the deepest queerness lies in recognizing that we are almost certainly committing the same error right now with contemporary predictions about artificial intelligence, consciousness transfer, or the limits of biological engineering, dismissing them as speculative excess when they may represent merely the logical extrapolation of physical law by minds sufficiently unshackled from present assumption bias. Yet we lack any reliable mechanism for distinguishing between Haldane's justified extrapolations and mere speculation, which means the queerness persists not as a solved puzzle, but as an eternal metacognitive trap. We are forced to hold simultaneously the knowledge that dismissing bold predictions is usually wise, and that it has repeatedly been catastrophically wrong, leaving us suspended in productive uncertainty about which predictions warrant serious consideration, and which represent the enthusiasms of ambitious minds mistaking possibility for probability. Imagine a cartographer in the 1600s who decides to create the most accurate map of his kingdom that has ever been made, and he becomes so committed to this task that he adds more and more detail, layer after layer, until the map grows to be as large as the kingdom itself. And eventually it becomes impossible to use because it has become as complex as the very thing it was meant to represent. And this is the essential paradox that the economist Charles Benini described when he observed that as you attempt to simulate a system with increasing accuracy and fidelity, the model itself becomes so intricate and unwieldy that it loses its primary purpose, which was to simplify and clarify understanding. The mechanism at work here is fundamentally about the trade-off between accuracy and utility, because while we might think that a perfectly accurate simulation would be the ultimate goal, the reality is that what makes a model valuable is not its correspondence to reality, but rather its ability to isolate and illuminate the specific aspects of reality that we actually care about. And when you include every variable, every interaction, and every detail, you have captured everything but explained nothing, much like knowing the exact location of every atom in a chess game tells you nothing about strategy or why one player defeats another. This paradox appears everywhere we look when we examine human attempts to understand complex systems. From weather forecasting, where meteorologists discover that adding more data inputs and more computational power sometimes produces less reliable predictions than simpler models, to economic forecasting, where the most elaborate mathematical models sometimes perform worse than basic heuristics or rules of thumb, to artificial intelligence systems that become so specialized in their accuracy that they fail in unexpected ways that a simpler algorithm would have handled gracefully. The psychological dimension of Benini simulation complexity is that we have an almost irresistible urge to believe that more information is better, that greater detail is superior, that a more elaborate explanation is closer to truth. Yet the human mind has limited capacity, and we navigate the world not by understanding everything, but by understanding the right things, the salient patterns that matter. And our best tools for understanding complex reality have always been parsimonious ones that capture essential relationships rather than exhaustive ones that capture everything. What makes this paradox persist is that we rarely experience the moment where additional complexity actually begins to harm our understanding, because there is usually a long middle range where more detail seems helpful and plausible, and we only discover the problem when we have already invested enormous effort. And by then, the sunk cost fallacy keeps us committed to refining the simulation rather than stepping back to ask whether we need it at all. The wisest practitioners of modeling learn to recognize this threshold and deliberately introduce constraints, limiting variables, accepting approximation, even embracing strategic ignorance, because they understand that a map half the size of the territory, if it captures the right relationships, will always be more useful than a perfect replica that requires you to consult the original just to read it. This is why the most effective leaders, scientists, and engineers often spend as much time deciding what to leave out of their models as they spend deciding what to put in, understanding that the real skill lies not in capturing complexity, but in discerning which complexities matter and which ones are merely noise that obscures the signal we are trying to hear. Beginning in the 1970s, economist Michael Polanyi observed a curious and deeply troubling phenomenon in the American economy. Despite massive investments in computers, automation, and information technology, overall productivity growth rates actually declined or remained stagnant during periods when technological advancement was supposed to be accelerating at unprecedented speeds, a contradiction that seemed to defy every expectation economists and business leaders held about the transformative power of innovation and digital tools. The paradox became even more pronounced as decades passed, with companies spending billions of dollars on new computer systems, software infrastructure, and automated processes, yet finding that their workers were not becoming measurably more productive, their output per hour was not increasing as dramatically as the investment suggested it should. And in many cases, the integration of these technologies actually seemed to slow down certain workflows and introduce unexpected inefficiencies that had not existed in the previous era of manual labor and paper-based systems. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates on multiple interconnected levels that reveal how easily we can mistake technological capability for actual human capability. When organizations acquire new technology, they must first spend considerable time and resources on training workers to use these systems, which initially reduces productivity as people struggle with unfamiliar interfaces and procedures. Beyond this obvious retraining period, however, lies a more subtle phenomenon. The technology often requires workers to learn entirely new ways of thinking about their tasks, to adapt their mental models of work, and to develop new problem-solving approaches that bear little resemblance to the intuitive methods they had refined over years of experience. Additionally, the implementation of new systems frequently introduces new layers of management, bureaucratic oversight, and standardized procedures designed to optimize the technology rather than the human worker, creating organizational friction that was absent before the technological intervention began. What makes this paradox persist despite having no logical reason to remain mysterious is our collective unwillingness to question the assumption that technology itself automatically generates productivity gains regardless of how it is deployed, integrated, or managed within human systems. We have normalized the idea that the mere existence of powerful computers and software represents progress toward greater efficiency, even as we observe in our own professional lives that emails have somehow created more work than telephone calls ever did, that digital filing systems are more confusing than filing cabinets, that meetings conducted through video conferencing technology seem to proliferate rather than diminish in frequency, and that the promise of technology making our lives easier has somehow transformed into technology making our lives more complicated and our schedules more saturated. The paradox endures because we rarely stop to examine whether the productivity we measure is actually measuring what matters, whether our metrics capture the full scope of human value and capability, or whether we have simply become comfortable accepting technological progress as its own justification, regardless of its actual impact on human flourishing and meaningful work. The deeper irony is that Polanyi himself understood that much of human knowledge and skill exists in the realm of the tacit and unarticulated, the things we know how to do but cannot fully explain or codify. Yet our technological solutions persistently attempt to make explicit, standardize, and automate precisely those dimensions of work that resist such translation. In the process, often destroying the very expertise and institutional memory that made organizations function effectively in the first place. Imagine a person working an entry-level job earning $30,000 a year, living paycheck to paycheck, unable to afford dental care or unexpected repairs, constantly stressed about making rent and feeding their family, yet when asked about their happiness, they report a certain baseline contentment with their life and relationships and daily experiences. Now imagine that same person receives a significant raise, doubling their income to $60,000 a year, and suddenly they can afford better housing, health care, and security for their loved ones, and they experience a noticeable increase in their sense of well-being and life satisfaction. But then something peculiar happens. After a few years of living at this new income level, they adapt to their circumstances, and their happiness levels gradually return to nearly what they were before the raise, even though they are objectively living in far better material conditions. Then they receive another promotion, another significant jump in income, and once again they experience that temporary surge of happiness and satisfaction, followed inevitably by the slow fade back to their baseline emotional state. This phenomenon, first documented by economist Richard Easterlin in the 1970s, reveals something deeply counterintuitive about human psychology and our relationship with money and material prosperity. The paradox works like this: money does increase happiness, but only up to a certain point, specifically the point where your income covers your basic needs and provides reasonable security and comfort. Beyond that threshold, additional income produces surprisingly diminishing returns on happiness and life satisfaction. What makes this even more paradoxical is that this pattern holds true both within individual lives across time and within societies when comparing wealthy nations to developing nations. Yet people continue to pursue ever-increasing income with the same fervent intensity as though each additional dollar will fundamentally transform their existence. The mechanism underlying this puzzle involves a psychological process called adaptation or hedonic treadmill, wherein humans naturally adjust their expectations and reference points to match their current circumstances, so that what once felt like luxury eventually becomes the baseline against which all new experiences are measured. A person earning $50,000 might dream of earning $100,000, imagining that such wealth would solve all their problems and provide lasting happiness. But research consistently shows that someone who actually achieves a $100,000 income experiences only a temporary elevation in mood before their internal happiness set point reasserts itself. The comparison effect compounds this phenomenon because our happiness is not derived merely from our absolute income, but from our relative income compared to those around us, so that even substantial increases in personal wealth can feel inadequate if our peers and colleagues and people we follow on social media have increased their wealth at similar or greater rates. We have normalized this paradox so thoroughly into our economic and cultural systems that we barely pause to question the fundamental mismatch between our endless pursuit of more money and the scientific evidence that additional money beyond sufficiency produces negligible increases in lasting happiness, suggesting that we are collectively running on a treadmill that moves faster and faster while carrying us nowhere. Driven by an illusion of future satisfaction that recedes perpetually into the distance like a mirage on an endless highway. Yet paradoxically, this knowledge rarely changes our behavior, because the pursuit of income is not purely rational. It is entangled with identity, status, security, and the deep human fear that we are never quite enough, suggesting that the real barrier to happiness may not be the amount of money we earn, but our willingness to question whether the game itself is worth playing. During the Vietnam War, Admiral James Stockdale was held as a prisoner of war for over 7 years in the notorious Hanoi Hilton, where he endured torture, solitary confinement, and conditions designed to break the human spirit. Yet he emerged as one of the war's most resilient survivors, and years later, when management theorist Jim Collins interviewed him about his experience, Stockdale described a paradoxical approach to survival that seemed to contradict everything we understand about how hope and pessimism should function in desperate circumstances. When Collins asked Stockdale which prisoners were most likely to die in captivity, the admiral responded that it was not those who had given up entirely, nor was it those who remained optimistic about imminent rescue, but rather those who set arbitrary deadlines for salvation that would inevitably pass unfulfilled, such as those who insisted they would certainly be released by Christmas, and when Christmas came and went without liberation. The psychological devastation of broken hope proved more lethal than despair itself. Yet Stockdale himself maintained an unwavering conviction that he would not only survive but ultimately prevail, and this apparent contradiction became the foundation of what Collins termed the Stockdale paradox, which suggests that the most effective approach to adversity requires simultaneously confronting the brutal facts of one's current reality while maintaining absolute faith in eventual triumph. A duality that seems logically impossible, yet proved psychologically invaluable in one of history's most extreme tests of human endurance. The mechanism behind this paradox lies in a fundamental reorientation of where one places hope and optimism, shifting it away from external timelines and rescue scenarios toward internal conviction and personal agency. And by accepting that suffering might continue indefinitely while refusing to abandon faith in one's capacity to find meaning and purpose within that suffering, individuals create a psychological buffer against the despair that comes from unfulfilled expectations. This approach requires what we might call tragic realism combined with existential optimism, where the realist acknowledges that the situation may never improve, that help may never arrive, that the pain may last indefinitely, while the optimist maintains unshakable belief in their own resilience, their ability to maintain dignity, and their ultimate capacity to endure and eventually transcend the circumstances. A belief grounded not in delusion, but in demonstrated capability and chosen values, rather than wishful thinking. What makes Stockdale optimism realism so paradoxical is that it persists in our understanding and application despite seeming to violate basic psychological principles, because we have been taught that optimism and realism are opposing forces, that hope requires denying difficulties, and that acknowledging hardship inevitably leads to despair. Yet Stockdale's experience and the experiences of others who have thrived in extreme conditions suggest something far more nuanced and powerful. That the human mind can hold two seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously without collapsing into dysfunction. This integration of unflinching realism with unshakable faith has proven remarkably applicable beyond warfare and captivity, appearing in the recovery strategies of addiction survivors, the resilience frameworks of trauma therapists, and the long-term vision of successful entrepreneurs who simultaneously plan for worst-case scenarios while committing fully to ambitious goals. Suggesting that Stockdale's hard-won wisdom represents not merely a survival tactic, but a fundamental principle of human psychological flourishing. The paradox ultimately reveals that resilience is not born from denying pain or blindly believing in rescue, but from the harder work of accepting what is while choosing who we will become within it, transforming circumstance from a prison into merely the arena where our character is forged. Consider the peculiar situation of those who hold tremendous power yet feel utterly powerless within the very domain where their authority should be absolute, a condition that reveals something deeply paradoxical about the nature of control itself. A chief executive officer might command the decisions of thousands of employees, control budgets in the millions, and shape the strategic direction of their entire organization, yet feel completely powerless to change the one thing that matters most to them, perhaps their ability to maintain a healthy relationship with their own family, or to escape the anxiety that grips them each morning before dawn, or to find genuine fulfillment beyond the metrics of quarterly earnings. The parent who exercises near total control over their child's daily life from what they eat to where they go to school to whom they spend time with, paradoxically finds themselves powerless to truly control whether that child will love them, respect them, or choose to remain in their life as an adult. The military general who commands armies and determines the fates of nations discovers that this tremendous power cannot compel loyalty without respect, cannot create courage in those who fear death, and cannot guarantee victory against an enemy with nothing left to lose. This paradox emerges from a fundamental misunderstanding about where power actually resides and what it can truly accomplish. For power over external circumstances, people, and systems operates under completely different laws than power over internal states, emotions, outcomes beyond our influence, and the hearts of others. The more we grasp and clutch at what we believe should be within our control, the more we often inadvertently reinforce our sense of powerlessness. Because true power rarely comes from force or command, but rather from acceptance, understanding, and the strategic release of impossible demands. We have normalized this paradox so thoroughly that we rarely notice it, constructing entire professional hierarchies and social systems around the assumption that those with the most external authority experience corresponding internal freedom, when in fact the opposite is frequently true, and those at the top often feel imprisoned by the very machinery of control they have built. The prison becomes most apparent when these powerful figures finally step down or lose their position, only to discover that the freedom they imagined never materializes, because they have forgotten how to exercise power over the only domain where it was always available to them: the cultivation of their own attention, choices, and meaning. The retired executive discovers that their calendar, once filled with meetings that felt mandatory, now stretches empty. The parent realizes their child's love cannot be purchased with provision. The general finds that commanding silence is not the same as commanding peace. In this moment of involuntary release, the paradox finally becomes visible. Power was never located in the external domain at all, but was always waiting in the space between stimulus and response, in the freedom to choose what matters, in the humility to distinguish between what can be controlled and what must simply be accepted. This realization, when it arrives, often comes too late for those who spent decades accumulating external power, yet it arrives nonetheless as a kind of mercy. The understanding that the janitor who tends their own garden with full presence, who speaks truthfully to those they love, and who has made peace with their limitations may possess far more genuine power than the executive who commands millions while remaining enslaved to their own restlessness and fear. And perhaps this is why the most formidable leaders in history, those who moved civilizations, were often those who had first surrendered their need to control outcomes, who had learned to distinguish between their will and their ego, and who discovered that true authority emerges not from the size of one's domain, but from the depth of one's freedom within it. Consider the person who prides themselves on being exceptionally tolerant of others' beliefs, lifestyles, and perspectives, yet finds themselves reaching a breaking point when confronted with someone who is intolerant, becoming rigidly judgmental and dismissive in response to that intolerance, thereby embodying the very quality they claim to despise. This individual has constructed an identity around acceptance and open-mindedness, viewing themselves as enlightened and evolved beyond the narrow-minded constraints that bind ordinary people. Yet their tolerance has developed a precise boundary beyond which it simply ceases to exist, transforming into its opposite with remarkable speed and conviction. The moment they encounter someone whose views they find sufficiently objectionable or offensive, the entire framework of their compassion collapses, and they deploy the same categorical dismissals and character judgments they would never direct toward those whose beliefs align with their own. The paradox deepens when we recognize that this person genuinely believes their intolerance toward intolerance is justified, even noble, a necessary exception to their otherwise universal acceptance, not recognizing that they have simply relocated their intolerance rather than transcended it. The psychological mechanism underlying this contradiction involves a form of moral licensing, where individuals grant themselves permission to violate their stated principles when they believe the violation is sufficiently motivated by righteous anger or ethical clarity, essentially creating an exemption clause in their own moral code that applies whenever they feel sufficiently provoked. They construct narratives in which their intolerance is defensive rather than offensive, protective rather than aggressive, framing it as a rational response to irrationality rather than acknowledging it as a failure of their stated values. What makes this paradox particularly persistent in modern discourse is that it has become normalized and even celebrated, with entire communities congratulating themselves for their intolerance toward those deemed sufficiently wrong or dangerous, creating echo chambers where this contradiction goes completely unexamined and unchallenged. We have developed sophisticated language to obscure this paradox, using terms like zero tolerance and no platforming to describe what are functionally intolerant acts, language that reframes exclusion as principles rather than preferences, judgment as discernment rather than prejudgment, and hostility as accountability rather than hostility. The uncomfortable truth is that true tolerance, if such a thing exists, would require extending the same generosity of interpretation and benefit of doubt to those we consider intolerant as we demand for ourselves, a feat so psychologically demanding that most of us simply declare it impossible rather than attempt it, thereby ensuring that intolerance will always have a ready supply of righteous opposition to justify its own existence. In this way, intolerance becomes self-perpetuating, each side convinced of their moral superiority, each pointing to the other's rigidity as justification for their own, creating a recursive cycle where the boundary between tolerance and intolerance shifts not based on principle, but on whose intolerance we happen to find most threatening in any given moment. The question we rarely ask ourselves is whether we would recognize our own intolerance if we encountered it, or whether we have become sufficiently skilled at rationalization that we could justify almost any exclusion or dismissal as a regrettable necessity rather than a choice, leaving us vulnerable to becoming precisely the thing we most vocally oppose. Perhaps the cruelest irony is that the moment we become certain we have identified true intolerance in another, we have already crossed the threshold into our own, having granted ourselves the certainty that permits us to stop listening, to stop questioning our own motives, and to treat another human being as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood. Consider the peculiar psychological state that emerges when nations invest heavily in military defense systems, weapons stockpiles, and strategic deterrence capabilities, all ostensibly undertaken with the singular goal of achieving lasting peace and security. Yet the very act of preparing for conflict with such intensity and sophistication paradoxically creates an environment of heightened anxiety, tension, and the perpetual possibility of the catastrophic outcomes these preparations were designed to prevent. This is the preparedness peace paradox, a fundamental contradiction that has persisted throughout modern history and continues to shape geopolitical relationships and individual psychology today. When a government announces a massive new defense budget or develops an advanced weapons system, the official narrative presented to the citizens emphasizes protection, safety, and the maintenance of peace through strength, creating a soothing psychological assurance that because we are prepared, we are safe. Yet the mere existence of these preparations, the knowledge that we possess the capacity to inflict unimaginable harm, and the certainty that other nations are engaged in identical preparations, creates a baseline state of existential dread that permeates society at subtle but pervasive levels. The mechanism operates through a psychological sleight of hand, wherein preparation becomes a substitute for actual peace, allowing societies to feel as though they are doing something productive while simultaneously normalizing the idea that conflict is inevitable and only our readiness stands between civilization and annihilation. This transforms peace into something conditional and fragile, requiring constant vigilance, continuous expenditure, and perpetual technological advancement, which in turn necessitates the identification of threats, real or imagined, to justify the cycle. The paradox deepens when we examine how this logic has become so thoroughly embedded in our collective consciousness that we struggle to imagine an alternative, a world in which nations simply did not prepare for war, not because it would be safe in any conventional sense, but because the preparation itself might be the very mechanism that makes peace impossible. We have created systems so complex and so interdependent that the threat of mutual destruction has become the only thing preventing mutual destruction. Yet this arrangement generates constant low-level psychological anxiety that manifests in political discourse, media narratives, and individual consciousness as a background hum of apprehension that we accept as simply the way the world must be. This acceptance of perpetual anxiety as inevitable becomes self-fulfilling. We cease questioning the premise itself, and in doing so, we ensure that the cycle perpetuates indefinitely, each generation inheriting not peace, but merely the postponement of catastrophe dressed in the language of security and national interest. The tragedy lies not in the existence of threats themselves, but in our collective agreement that the only rational response to uncertainty is the accumulation of the very instruments of destruction we fear, a logic so pervasive that proposing alternatives, disarmament, radical transparency, genuine conflict resolution infrastructure, is reflexively dismissed as naive or dangerous, thereby ensuring that the paradox remains not just unsolved, but fundamentally unexamined across generations. Yet perhaps the deepest irony is that this unexamined paradox has become so normalized that nations now measure their security not by the absence of conflict, but by their capacity to survive it, transforming peace from a positive state of harmony into merely the negative space between wars, a conceptual shift so subtle and profound that it has fundamentally altered what we believe is even possible for human civilization to achieve. Imagine you walk into a restaurant and your meal arrives cold, the service is slow, and your drink order is forgotten entirely. You're frustrated, disappointed, and considering never returning to this establishment again. But then something unexpected happens. The manager approaches your table, apologizes sincerely, comps your entire meal, offers you a generous discount on your next visit, and perhaps even provides you with a complimentary appetizer as compensation. Suddenly, your entire experience transforms in your mind, and you leave feeling not just satisfied, but oddly grateful, even loyal to the restaurant, despite the fact that you received poor service in the first place. This phenomenon is known as service recovery satisfaction, and it represents one of the most peculiar paradoxes embedded within modern consumer psychology and business relationships. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating is that the customer would have been happier overall if the service had simply been adequate from the beginning rather than poor followed by recovery. Yet the recovery itself creates a form of satisfaction that often exceeds what normal, uninterrupted good service produces. The psychological mechanism driving this paradox operates through several interconnected layers of human cognition and emotional processing. When a service failure occurs, it creates what psychologists call a violation of expectations, which generates genuine disappointment and negative emotion in the consumer. However, the human brain is extraordinarily responsive to narrative arcs and redemption stories, and when an organization makes visible, genuine efforts to repair the damage, it triggers a powerful emotional response that involves gratitude, surprise, and a sense of being valued as a customer. The manager or employee who apologizes and compensates you is essentially reframing the entire interaction from a story of negligence into a story of recovery and care, and the brain finds this narrative arc deeply satisfying on an almost psychological level. Additionally, there exists what researchers call the service recovery paradox, which suggests that customers who experience a service failure that is then effectively recovered often report higher satisfaction and loyalty than customers who never experienced a failure at all. This occurs partly because the recovery effort signals to the customer that the company cares enough about them to invest resources and effort into making things right, which paradoxically builds trust and emotional connection more effectively than simply providing good service from the start. The customer's perception shifts from viewing the company as indifferent to viewing it as genuinely committed to their satisfaction. Furthermore, the compensation provided during recovery creates what behavioral economists call the reciprocity principle, where receiving an unexpected gift or benefit triggers an innate human desire to reciprocate that generosity through loyalty and positive word of mouth. What persists in this paradox, despite its fundamental illogic, is the reality that we have collectively normalized failure in consumer interactions to such an extent that competent recovery has become a competitive advantage rather than a basic expectation. We live in a system where restaurants overbook tables, hotels oversell rooms, airlines routinely overcharge for baggage, and service failures are treated as inevitable aspects of the customer experience rather than unacceptable breakdowns. In this context, when a company demonstrates genuine concern and takes measurable steps to rectify a problem, it stands out so dramatically from the baseline of indifference that it triggers genuine emotional satisfaction. The paradox deepens when we recognize that customers would logically prefer a system where such failures never occurred in the first place. Yet the recovery satisfaction they experience makes them less likely to demand systemic improvements and more likely to forgive ongoing organizational dysfunction. Consider the common practice of enriching animal enclosures in zoos, laboratories, and homes with toys, structures, and environmental stimuli designed to prevent boredom and psychological distress in captive creatures. And you will find yourself confronting a peculiar logical contradiction that rarely receives explicit acknowledgement. The enrichment cage paradox emerges from the fundamental tension between two opposing realities. We provide enrichment objects and activities specifically because we recognize that confinement within artificially limited spaces causes genuine suffering and cognitive deprivation in animals. Yet the very act of providing enrichment within that confined space simultaneously serves to make captivity more psychologically tolerable without addressing the underlying condition of confinement itself. The paradox operates like this. If an animal in a bear cage is suffering from lack of stimulation, and we observe that suffering, we are admitting that the cage itself is inadequate for the animal's well-being, yet rather than expanding or eliminating the cage, we add complexity within it, which then reduces the visible signs of distress, which then allows us to feel justified in maintaining the original cage dimensions. A captive primate provided with puzzle feeders and climbing structures will display fewer stereotypic behaviors, will appear more engaged in content, and will seem less obviously miserable than the same primate in an empty enclosure. Yet the enrichment has not increased its territory, has not restored its natural social structures, has not returned it to anything resembling its ecological niche, and cannot possibly satisfy the profound needs that shaped its evolutionary psychology. We have essentially created a paradox where the solution to the problem becomes a mechanism that perpetuates the problem indefinitely. Because the enrichment succeeds just enough in reducing our own emotional discomfort at observing captivity that we no longer feel the urgent pressure to fundamentally alter the captive arrangement. This paradox reveals something troubling about how we approach constraint and suffering more broadly, suggesting that we have become comfortable with providing decorative improvements to fundamentally inadequate systems rather than confronting whether those systems should exist at all. And over time, this pattern has become so normalized that we now celebrate enrichment as evidence of ethical animal care, when it might instead be understood as evidence of a persistent ethical failure that we have learned to accept as inevitable and even virtuous. This same logic extends beyond animal contexts into how we structure human institutions. We add mental health services and recreational programs to prisons while leaving incarceration itself unquestioned. We provide stress relief initiatives within exploitative workplaces rather than examining whether the work itself is just. And we install art installations in impoverished neighborhoods as if aesthetic improvements can substitute for material equality, each time mistaking decoration for justice. The enrichment cage paradox thus becomes a mirror in which we avoid seeing ourselves. We mistake incremental comfort for meaningful change, and in doing so, we preserve the structures that require enrichment in the first place, transforming our compassion into a tool that sustains the very systems our compassion was meant to challenge. The most insidious aspect of this mechanism is that it allows institutions and individuals to experience themselves as ethical actors, as caring stewards making reasonable compromises, precisely at the moment when they are most effectively neutralizing the moral discomfort that might otherwise compel genuine systemic change, ensuring that the cage remains invisible by making it just comfortable enough to stop questioning whether cages should exist at all. And so the enrichment cage paradox succeeds not by making captivity invisible, but by making it seem inevitable and even humane, transforming our moral failure into institutional policy while we congratulate ourselves on our compassion. Consider the peculiar contradiction that defines modern meat consumption in developed nations. The vast majority of people who eat meat report loving animals, feeling emotional connections to pets, expressing concern about animal welfare, and yet simultaneously participating in systems that produce the very meat they consume through methods they would find deeply disturbing if witnessed firsthand. This paradox manifests across billions of individual daily choices, where consumers purchase packaged meat products without any genuine awareness of or confrontation with the conditions under which those animals lived, suffered, or died to reach their plates. The psychological mechanism that enables this contradiction operates through a process of deliberate cognitive separation, wherein the animal in the farm or factory remains fundamentally disconnected in the consumer's mind from the product in the supermarket, a phenomenon so complete that many people can simultaneously hold strong beliefs about animal protection while never recognizing the logical inconsistency embedded in their own behavior. The distance between production and consumption has been engineered to be as great as possible, with industrial meat production deliberately located far from population centers, with supply chains deliberately obscured, with marketing deliberately focused on the finished product rather than its origin, creating a comfortable psychological space where contradiction can flourish without generating the cognitive dissonance that direct confrontation would produce. What makes this paradox so remarkable is not merely that it exists, but that it persists with such cultural normalization that questioning it often feels radical rather than questioning our acceptance of it feeling naive. We have constructed an entire economic and social infrastructure designed specifically to maintain this separation, and we have internalized the practice so thoroughly that most people never pause to examine whether their expressed values about animals actually align with their purchasing decisions and dietary habits. The paradox deepens when one considers that surveys consistently show majorities of people believe animals deserve protection from cruelty. Yet these same people participate in demand chains that subject animals to conditions they would instantly recognize as cruel if the walls of industrial facilities were made transparent. Suggesting that the paradox persists not through ignorance alone, but through a sophisticated social architecture that actively discourages alignment between stated values and actual behavior, creating instead a comfortable mythology where meat simply exists as a commodity rather than as a product of systematic animal confinement and suffering. This mythology is maintained through language itself. We speak of harvesting rather than killing, of processing plants rather than slaughterhouses, of protein sources rather than individual sentient beings. Linguistic choices that function as cognitive buffers, allowing us to discuss the reality while remaining insulated from its moral weight. The paradox thus reveals less about human hypocrisy and more about how thoroughly we can restructure our perception of reality when the alternative, genuine alignment between values and behavior, demands sacrifice we are culturally unprepared to make. Yet this restructuring of perception extends beyond language into the architectural design of our cities themselves. The absence of slaughterhouses from urban landscapes, the routing of livestock transport through secondary roads at night, the zoning laws that effectively hide industrial animal agriculture from public view, all conspire to maintain the paradox by ensuring that those who benefit most from this system need never witness its operations, allowing the comfortable fiction to persist indefinitely. Consider the peculiar situation wherein we have accumulated vast amounts of detailed information about hedgehogs, yet this knowledge exists in a strange inverse relationship with the actual relevance or practical application of hedgehogs in most human lives, creating what might be called a paradox of disproportionate expertise about creatures that most people will never encounter in any meaningful way. The hedgehog, a small nocturnal mammal native to Europe, Asia, and Africa, has become the subject of elaborate scientific study, detailed behavioral documentation, precise dietary recommendations, and comprehensive veterinary protocols. Yet the overwhelming majority of human beings who possess this knowledge will never actually interact with a hedgehog in their lifetime. And many who do will only encounter them through popular culture representations or as exotic pets that bear little resemblance to their wild counterparts. We have developed intricate understanding of their spinal structure, their hibernation patterns, their foraging behaviors, their social hierarchies, and their responses to environmental stimuli. And yet this accumulated knowledge serves virtually no practical purpose for most of humanity and exists primarily as intellectual exercise or curiosity-driven research that expands knowledge for its own sake rather than for any tangible benefit. The psychological mechanism operating here involves our tendency to pursue and systematize information about anything that captures our interest, regardless of whether that information will ever prove useful in our actual lives, a phenomenon deeply rooted in human curiosity and the satisfaction we derive from understanding complexity and acquiring mastery over domains of knowledge. We have created entire disciplines around understanding creatures that most of us will never need to interact with. Yet this strikes us as entirely normal and acceptable, perhaps even praiseworthy, because we have culturally embedded the notion that knowledge itself is inherently valuable, and that understanding the natural world in comprehensive detail is a worthy pursuit regardless of practical application. The hedgehog has become a repository for human expertise that exists almost entirely separate from human necessity, and we accept this paradox without question, viewing it as simply the natural outcome of scientific curiosity and educational systems designed to produce well-rounded individuals capable of understanding diverse aspects of the natural world, even when those aspects remain perpetually distant from everyday experience. Yet perhaps this disconnection itself reveals something profound about human cognition. We are creatures driven not by survival necessity, but by the sheer architectural beauty of knowledge systems themselves, and the hedgehog, with its quills, its curling reflex, its modest existence, becomes an elegant metaphor for how we construct elaborate intellectual edifices around the inconsequential, transforming minor details of the natural world into monuments of understanding that serve primarily to satisfy our deep psychological need to know, to categorize, to achieve mastery over domains that will never demand our attention. And so we find ourselves in possession of hedgehog facts we will never need: the precise temperature at which they enter torpor, the optimal humidity levels for their enclosures, the distinction between four-toed and five-toed species. Accumulating these details as if they were precious stones, polishing them with scholarly attention, passing them forward through textbooks and documentaries to future generations who will likewise never require them. Perpetuating a cycle of elaborate knowledge production that validates itself simply through its own existence and complexity. Imagine a person who has spent months, perhaps years, carefully reducing their consumption and living with minimal waste, making conscious decisions about every purchase, every piece of packaging, every resource they use, and through genuine effort and sacrifice, they finally achieve a lifestyle that feels genuinely sustainable and environmentally responsible. Then something remarkable happens. They experience a sudden, almost involuntary surge of consumption that seems entirely disconnected from their previous restraint, as if their body and mind had been keeping a hidden ledger of all the things they denied themselves. And now, having proven their commitment to conservation, they feel entitled to a compensatory period of excess that somehow cancels out or neutralizes all their previous sacrifice. This phenomenon, which we might call the rebound conservation paradox, describes the psychological pattern wherein people who successfully reduce their environmental impact through restriction and discipline paradoxically increase their consumption in other areas, effectively rebounding to consume nearly as much as before, rendering their conservation efforts largely ineffectual in terms of net environmental benefit. The mechanism operates through a deeply embedded psychological principle related to mental accounting and moral licensing, where the human mind treats ethical or environmental actions as deposits into an invisible account, creating what psychologists call a license to engage in less virtuous behavior without experiencing guilt or cognitive dissonance. When someone successfully conserves water for months, carefully monitors their energy usage, or eliminates meat from their diet, the brain registers these actions as moral achievements, and this sense of achievement generates a peculiar permission slip that feels entirely justified. Since you have already done the hard work of conservation, your mind whispers, surely you have earned the right to indulge elsewhere, perhaps by purchasing something unnecessary, taking more frequent flights, or consuming more of a different resource that feels psychologically distant from your area of primary focus. What makes this paradox particularly stubborn and resistant to rational understanding is that the rebound effect persists even when people are fully conscious of its existence and genuinely care about environmental impact, suggesting that the mechanism operates at a level of consciousness that exists somewhat beneath or alongside our rational deliberations. We have normalized this pattern to such an extent that it appears in countless domains beyond environmentalism. The person who exercises intensely for weeks feels justified in consuming excess calories. The person who works extra hours feels deserving of frivolous spending. The person who achieves one goal feels entitled to relaxation that extends far beyond reasonable rest. This paradox reveals something unsettling about how human motivation and willpower function, suggesting that our capacity for restraint and virtue might not be a reservoir that grows with use, but rather a currency that becomes depleted, requiring compensation and interest payments that ultimately negate our progress, trapping us in cycles where genuine sacrifice produces no lasting change because our psychology insists on evening the scales, one way or another. The cruel irony is that recognizing this pattern intellectually does nothing to dissolve it, because the paradox operates not through ignorance, but through a fundamental architecture of human psychology that treats balance and equilibrium as moral necessities, making the person who understands the rebound effect feel doubly justified, once for their conservation, and again for their sophisticated awareness of their own limitations. Imagine a scenario that has captivated the minds of physicists and philosophers for decades, one that exists primarily in the realm of thought experiment, but carries with it a peculiar weight of logical consideration. The buttered cat rotation paradox emerges from combining two separate observations about the physical world, both of which appear to be true in isolation, yet create an impossible situation when merged together. On one hand, there exists the well-documented phenomenon that cats, when dropped from various heights, possess an uncanny ability to land on their feet due to their flexible spine and instinctive righting reflex, a survival mechanism honed through millions of years of evolution that allows them to reorient their bodies mid-fall. On the other hand, there is the equally observable truth that buttered toast, when dropped from a table, tends to land butterside down with surprising consistency, a tendency so reliable that it has become embedded in popular culture and folklore, often attributed to the principle that buttered bread is heavier on the buttered side and therefore rotates during its descent to land with the heavier, more damaged side facing downward. The paradox, therefore, asks a deceptively simple question. What happens if you tape a piece of buttered toast, butterside up, to the back of a cat, and then drop this combined entity from a height? According to the laws of physics as they relate to cats, the cat should land on its feet, yet according to the behavior of buttered toast, the butter should land face down. These two forces, theoretically speaking, create an irreconcilable conflict, leading to absurdist conclusions such as the notion that the cat and toast system might hover indefinitely above the ground, spinning perpetually in an attempt to satisfy both physical principles simultaneously, or that it might rotate at extreme speeds, generating enough energy to defy gravity itself. The psychological appeal of this paradox lies in its elegant simplicity and the way it exploits the human tendency to accept established observations without fully questioning their underlying mechanisms or considering their interaction with other phenomena. We encounter cats landing on their feet so frequently in anecdotes and viral videos that we accept this as an almost supernatural ability, imbuing it with an almost magical quality despite its roots in legitimate biomechanics. Similarly, the buttered toast phenomenon has become so normalized in popular understanding that it serves as a metaphor for general misfortune, a shorthand expression of Murphy's Law in its most mundane form. What makes the paradox persist is that neither of these observations is actually false or scientifically invalid. They are merely incomplete descriptions of complex physical situations that involve variables such as height, velocity, weight distribution, air resistance, spin rate, and the precise moment of contact with the ground. The paradox gains its power not from scientific contradiction, but from the way it highlights the gap between our casual observations and our actual understanding of the mechanisms that produce those observations, forcing us to confront the possibility that our everyday understanding of reality may be missing crucial details or context. In attempting to resolve the paradox, scientists and thinkers have proposed various solutions, including the suggestion that the combined system would indeed spin, but at a rate that would depend on the relative weights and moments of inertia of both the cat and the toast, or that the cat's righting reflex might actually counteract the rotation tendency of the toast, creating a complex dynamical system rather than a simple stalemate. What remains striking, however, is how readily this thought experiment captures our imagination and how willingly we suspend our critical faculties to engage with its apparent contradiction, perhaps because it speaks to something deeply human about our relationship with physical laws and our sense that the universe might contain hidden contradictions waiting to ambush us.